I don't know when it started, only that one day I began to feel as if I were no longer entirely in control of my own actions. It began subtly, small moments when I'd lose track of time, missing minutes or even hours that seemed to vanish without explanation. At first, I chalked it up to stress at work or the inevitable distraction of a busy life. But soon, the gaps in my memory grew too frequent to ignore. I'd be having a conversation with a friend, only to later realize that the details of what I said were entirely different from what she recalled. I couldn't remember how I'd arrived at certain places or why I'd reacted in ways that were completely out of character. The changes in my behavior were even more alarming. One evening, I found myself sitting at a restaurant, smiling and laughing with colleagues, a version of myself that felt foreign. When the bill arrived, I couldn't recall ordering a dessert that had clearly been there, and my co-worker swore I'd been talking about a topic I had no memory of even mentioning. I tried to confront one of them about it, but they just exchanged uneasy glances and brushed off my questions. It was as if, for a brief moment, I had been someone else entirely, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen hand. At home, things grew increasingly disconcerting. I would wake up in the middle of the night with a lingering sense of dread, as if someone had been watching me while I slept. I began noticing unfamiliar marks on my skin, small scratches and bruises that I swore I hadn't inflicted on myself. My apartment, once a sanctuary of predictable order, started to feel manipulated. Objects that I distinctly remembered placing in one spot were suddenly found in another, and sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of my own reflection moving a fraction of a second before I did. It was as if the world around me were operating on a different timeline, one where my actions were being preempted by something or someone else. I tried to document everything in a journal, recording the times I lost track of my day and noting every inexplicable detail. But even that became unreliable. On several mornings, I would wake to find pages of my journal mysteriously blank, as if the words had been wiped away, leaving me with nothing to prove what had been happening. I began to suspect that my memories were being selectively erased, rewritten, or even implanted by an external force. The idea was as terrifying as it was unprovable, and it left me with an ever-present feeling of being watched from the inside out. My relationships began to suffer, too. Friends and family started acting as though they were in on a secret that I couldn't decipher. My sister, who had always been supportive, started asking me, "Are you sure that's really how it happened?" whenever I recounted even the simplest events. At work, a coworker once remarked that I seemed different that day, as though I were not fully present. I tried to explain that I was feeling scattered, as if parts of my day were missing, but they only laughed it off, suggesting I was overworked. The more I tried to articulate my fears, the more isolated I felt, like I was the only one aware that something fundamental had shifted. The most unnerving moment came one rainy night when I was alone in my apartment. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. As I stared blankly at the ceiling, I suddenly heard a soft, measured whisper that wasn't my own. "Control," it said, over and over, each repetition seeming to squeeze the air from the room. I bolted upright, heart hammering in my chest, but no one was there. The sound seemed to emanate from within me, as though it were the very echo of a part of myself that I couldn't reach. In that moment, the realization struck me with bone-deep clarity. I was not merely losing time or forgetting my actions. I was being manipulated from within. Since then, every day has become a battle to assert my own identity. I find myself questioning every memory, every impulse, wondering if it truly belongs to me or if it was implanted during one of those inexplicable lapses. The sensation of being watched has evolved into a constant oppressive presence, a feeling that something is steering my actions from the shadows. I've attempted to seek help from professionals, but their tests and evaluations show nothing wrong with me, only a mind that appears to be hypervigilant. Now, as I sit here writing this in the dim glow of a bedside lamp, the room feels both familiar and alien. I no longer trust my recollections, and every time I catch my reflection in a mirror, I half expect to see an unfamiliar glint in my eyes. I've come to accept that I may never have definitive answers about what is happening to me. Perhaps I'm caught in a cycle of manipulation that erases and rewrites moments of my life without my consent. Whether it's a glitch in my own mind or a far more sinister force exerting control from outside, I cannot shake the feeling that I am not entirely free. And as the night deepens, I remain haunted by that single, terrifying thought that the part of me I can't control may be forever steering my life. And no matter how hard I try, I may never escape the invisible hand that continues to guide my every step. It started with a simple mistake. I had just moved into a quiet apartment complex on the outskirts of town, a small brick building with outdated fixtures but a decent rent. The kind of place where no one really talks to their neighbors, just an exchange of nods in the hallway. I liked it that way, but on my second night there, as I was sorting through moving boxes, I found something that didn't belong to me. A small package, tucked behind my couch as if it had been deliberately placed there. At first, I assumed the previous tenant had left it behind. The package was wrapped in brown paper with no address, no name, nothing to indicate where it had come from. It was light, barely anything inside. I hesitated, then unwrapped it. Inside was an old Polaroid picture, a black and white image of my apartment door. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. The angle was slightly off, as if it had been taken from the stairwell across the hall. The door looked the same as it did now, right down to the small dent near the handle. But something about the photograph felt wrong. The lighting was off, like it had been taken in the middle of the night, and there was a faint blur near the bottom, as if someone had been standing just outside the frame. I should have thrown it away. I should have ignored it. Instead, I kept it. I told myself it was probably some leftover junk. Maybe the previous tenant had been an artist or something. A weird coincidence. Nothing more. But then, the noises started. At first, it was small things. Soft creaks from the hallway at odd hours. The faint sound of someone pacing above me, even though the unit upstairs was vacant. I tried to ignore it, but then I began waking up to an odd sound outside my door. A tapping. Light, deliberate. Not like someone knocking, but like fingertips dragging along the wood. The first time, I froze in bed, holding my breath as the sound continued for nearly a full minute before stopping abruptly. When I finally worked up the nerve to check through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The next morning, I asked my next-door neighbor, an older man named Carl, if he'd heard anything strange. He just frowned and shook his head. "Not much noise around here," he said. "Been quiet as long as I've lived here." I nodded, pretending I believed him. But that night, the tapping returned. And this time, I heard something else breathing. I pressed my ear against the door, my pulse hammering, and for a few seconds, I swore I could hear someone breathing on the other side. Slow, shallow inhales. Then silence. I barely slept that night. In the morning, I checked my door and noticed something that made my blood run cold. My welcome mat had been shifted slightly, turned just enough that I could tell someone had moved it. The next few days were quiet. I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined everything. Maybe it was stress, the new apartment, unfamiliar noises settling into my mind in ways that made them seem worse than they were. I even stopped thinking about the Polaroid, until I found another one. It was tucked beneath my door when I came home from work. This time, the picture was taken from inside my apartment. I dropped it immediately, my skin crawling. The angle was unmistakable. It was from my living room, pointed toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. Someone had been inside. I tore through my apartment, checking every closet, every locked window. Nothing was out of place. The door was still locked, deadbolt secure. There was no sign of forced entry. And yet, someone had stood in my living room long enough to take a picture. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the apartment sent me into a spiral of paranoia. I checked the locks over and over, sat awake with a kitchen knife clutched in my hands. But nothing happened. No tapping, no breathing, just silence. The next morning, I packed a bag and went straight to my landlord's office. I demanded to know who had access to my apartment. He looked at me like I was crazy. "No one," he said. "Not unless you ask for maintenance." I didn't. He sighed and rubbed his temples. "Look, I can change the locks if it'll make you feel better, but I've never had any complaints about break-ins here. You sure you're not just imagining things?" I wanted to scream at him. Instead, I nodded. Yeah, maybe. He changed the locks that afternoon. I stayed at a motel that night, but when I returned the next morning, something was waiting for me. A new Polaroid. This one wasn't of my apartment. It was of me. I recognized the jacket I was wearing from the day before. The picture had been taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking it. I was walking to my car outside the motel. My stomach dropped. Whoever this was, they had followed me. I didn't go inside. I didn't even hesitate. I turned around, got in my car, and drove straight to the police station. The officer at the front desk was polite, but unimpressed. So, someone's leaving you pictures? Yes, I snapped. Of my apartment. Of me. I showed him the photos, but he just sighed and leaned back in his chair. Look, I get why this is freaking you out, but technically no crime's been committed. You didn't see anyone break in, nothing's been stolen, and these pictures? They could be old, for all we know. They're not, I said, voice shaking. The last one was taken yesterday. He scratched his chin. I can file a report, but unless something happens, there's not much we can do. I left feeling worse than before. That night, I stayed at a friend's place, but even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every car that passed by, every shadow outside the window made my skin crawl. The next day, I went back to my apartment to grab the rest of my things. I had already made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care about breaking the lease. But when I got to my door, I stopped cold. The welcome mat had been moved again, and there was one final Polaroid. This one wasn't a picture. It was just words scrawled in thick, uneven handwriting across the white border. You can't leave. I didn't go inside. I didn't pack. I got in my car and left, drove until I was 3 towns away, and found a cheap motel. The next day, I signed a lease on a new place and never looked back. That was over a year ago. I don't tell many people about what happened, because most don't believe me. They think I'm paranoid, that I imagine half of it, that some prankster was messing with me. But I know the truth. Someone was watching me, and whoever they were, they wanted me to know that no matter where I went, I'd never be alone. I came home from work one evening, exhausted, ready to collapse onto the couch. As I reached for the front door, my hand hesitated. The knob was different. It was brass, shiny, almost new-looking, but I knew for a fact that my doorknob had always been dull silver. I stood there for a moment, my fingers hovering above it, heart pounding for no reason I could explain. Maybe I just never paid attention before. I told myself. Maybe I was remembering it wrong. I shook off the unease and went inside. Everything else looked normal. The couch was exactly where I left it. The mail was still on the table. Even my half-empty coffee cup from the morning sat next to the sink. It was just the doorknob. Nothing to be afraid of. But then, the next day, the kitchen tiles changed. I almost dropped my coffee when I saw them. They had always been plain white. Cheap, slightly discolored from years of wear. But now, a subtle pattern swirled across them, faint floral designs curling at the edges. I knelt down, running my fingers over the surface, but they felt the same, just smooth, cold ceramic. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through old pictures, trying to find one of the kitchen. My hands trembled as I finally found a shot from a few weeks ago, me cooking, a blurry reflection of the tiles visible in the oven door. They were plain white, no pattern. I called my best friend, Sarah. Hey, quick question, I said, forcing a laugh to cover the tightness in my chest. Do you remember what my kitchen tiles look like? She hesitated. Yeah? They have that little floral design, right? My breath caught. No, they were plain, completely plain. Another pause. Then her voice, careful. I guess I never really looked that closely, but I always thought they had a pattern. A chill crawled down my spine. I wanted to argue, but what would I even say? That I was completely sure my tiles had changed overnight? That my doorknob had switched materials? She'd think I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. But things kept changing. Small things at first. The handle on my coffee mug, which had always been chipped, was suddenly smooth and whole. My bedroom window, which used to creak loudly when opened, now slid silently as if it had been replaced. And then the bigger thing started. One evening, I called my mom like I always did, just to check in. She answered, cheerful as ever, and we talked for a few minutes before she asked, "How's your cat doing?" I nearly dropped the phone. I don't have a cat, I said slowly. She laughed. Oh, stop it. You've had Max for years. You sent me pictures last week. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. Mom, I don't have a cat. I've never had a cat. The silence on the other end stretched too long. Then a nervous chuckle. Sweetheart, are you feeling okay? I hung up. I tore through my apartment, searching for any sign of this so-called cat. There was nothing. No litter box, no food bowls, no stray hairs clinging to the couch. But when I checked my phone, my stomach turned to ice. There, in my camera roll, were pictures of me holding a gray tabby cat I had never seen before. I sat down hard on the floor, my breath coming in short gasps. I look happy in the photos, smiling, petting Max like he had been with me forever. But I had no memory of him. None. The next morning, I woke up to find a bag of cat food in my pantry. I stopped talking to people about it after that. Every time I tried to point out something that had changed, they just looked at me funny, like I was the one getting details wrong. I even saw a doctor convinced that maybe I had a brain tumor or some kind of memory disorder. But all the tests came back normal. No signs of damage. No medical explanation for what was happening. And yet, my world kept shifting. A few weeks later, Sarah called me, laughing about some trip we took last summer. I still can't believe we got stuck in that motel with the weird paintings, she said. I went cold. I had never been on that trip. I didn't say anything at first. I just let her talk, hoping some part of it would spark a memory, but it was all completely foreign to me. Sarah, I finally said, I think you're confusing me with someone else. The silence stretched. Then, quietly, she said, don't do this. I blinked. Do what? She sighed. You always do this. Every few months, you start acting weird, saying things don't match up, that you don't remember stuff. It's like you forget huge chunks of your own life. A wave of nausea hit me. Sarah, I whispered, this has never happened before. She didn't say anything. And then, she hung up. I sat there, staring at my phone, shaking. If what she said was true, if I'd done this before, then this wasn't just something happening to me. It was something I was caught in, a loop I didn't even remember repeating. I started wondering if the changes had always been happening, but I only noticed them sometimes. What if the life I thought I was living was nothing more than fragments, rearranged over and over? I started keeping a log, writing down everything that fell off, but every morning, pages would be missing. I started hiding notes in places I wouldn't think to check. Inside old books, tucked into my winter coat pockets. And every time I found them again, they felt like messages from another version of me. It's happening again. You won't remember this tomorrow. Don't trust them. I don't know who them is. I don't know how much time I've lost. I don't know if the people around me are real, or if they change along with everything else. All I know is that I'm afraid to sleep. Because every time I wake up, my world is just a little different. And I'm starting to wonder if, one day, it will change so much that I won't even recognize myself anymore. I first noticed something was off on an ordinary Thursday evening. I'd just returned home from work, a routine I'd followed for years. And as I unlocked the front door, I paused. The door frame, usually a dull white, now appeared slightly discolored, as though someone had brushed it with a coat of grime I couldn't quite identify. I chalked it up to a trick of the low light, or perhaps a new cleaning product my landlord had used, and I went inside. But that night, as I sat watching TV in the dim living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in the corners were moving just a bit too deliberately. Over the next few days, small things began to vanish or change without explanation. My favorite coffee mug, always resting on the kitchen counter, was suddenly missing one morning, only to reappear later on the dining table, turned upside down. The doorknob that I'd always known to be a matte silver now gleamed as though freshly polished. I glanced around the apartment, wondering if I was imagining things. At work, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a window, and for a moment, my eyes seemed to hold a strange, faraway look. I brushed it off as fatigue, but a seed of unease had been planted. One evening, as I was tidying up the living room, I noticed scratch marks on the wall by the bookshelf. They were shallow, almost like someone had run a fingernail lightly along the plaster, and I was sure they weren't there before. I mentioned it to my roommate, Lisa, but she just frowned and said, I don't see anything. Maybe you bumped your elbow against the wall? I insisted I hadn't, but she shrugged and went back to her book. I couldn't shake the sensation that my home was subtly shifting, rearranging itself in ways I couldn't document. Then came the nights when I started losing time. I'd be in the middle of reading, only to realize that hours had slipped by. Text messages on my phone that I didn't remember sending, and emails with content I couldn't recall composing. I set up a journal, determined to record every odd occurrence. Yet each morning, a few pages would be inexplicably missing, as if someone, or something, had been reading over my shoulder and erasing parts of my recollection. The phenomenon escalated one rainy evening. I had just settled in a bed when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were soft at first, a rhythmic tapping that I assumed was my building settling. But as the sound grew closer, I sat up, heart pounding. I crept toward the door, flashlight in hand, and peered out. The hallway was empty, its walls lined with familiar photos and worn wallpaper. I mustered the courage to step outside, only to find that the corridor's end was shrouded in an unnatural darkness. The light fixtures, which I'd always taken for granted, now flickered erratically as if struggling against an unseen force. Desperate for reassurance, I called my neighbor Harold, a friendly older gentleman who had lived in the building for decades. "Harold, do you ever notice anything strange happening around here? Like things moving or disappearing?" I asked hesitantly. There was a long pause before he replied in a low, measured tone. "Strange things happen to everyone, son. Sometimes it's the house, sometimes it's something else." His words sent a chill down my spine, especially since he never used to talk about odd occurrences. I pressed him for details, but he only sighed. "You shouldn't worry about things you can't explain." As the weeks wore on, the disturbances grew bolder. I would find objects in places I was sure I'd left them, only to discover that when I returned to look, they had been subtly rearranged, my keys, a pen, even a framed photograph of my family. The marks on the walls became more pronounced, and once, I even found fresh footprints in the dust along the hallway, tiny and almost childlike, as if someone had tiptoed through my home. I tried recording everything, setting up a camera in the living room, but every time I reviewed the footage, it was as if the room had reset to normal, with no trace of the anomalies I experienced. I began questioning my own sanity. Friends and co-workers insisted that nothing was wrong, that my home looked exactly the same, and that I must have been sleep-deprived. I tried to point out the changes, a misplaced lamp, the altered doorknob, the scratch marks, but they dismissed my concerns, suggesting I was overreacting. The more I tried to explain, the more isolated I felt, as if I were trapped in a reality that no one else could see. Then one night, I awoke to a low murmur, so soft I could barely hear it, that seemed to come from deep within the walls. It was a sound that resonated in my bones, almost like a whispered warning. I sat frozen in bed, straining to listen as the murmur built into a rhythmic pulse. My heart raced, and I felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched from within the very structure of my home. In that moment, I realized the changes weren't random glitches. They were deliberate, as if the fabric of my environment was being manipulated by an unseen hand. I started to notice that even the people I interacted with seemed off. A coworker who once joked about my quirky habits now spoke in clipped, emotionless tones whenever I mentioned my experiences. At the grocery store, the cashier gave me a blank look as if my questions about misplaced items were absurd. It wasn't just that I was noticing these changes, it was that everyone else seemed oblivious, their behavior unaltered while I felt increasingly alienated in my own life. One particularly harrowing night, I sat alone in my living room, the only light coming from a flickering lamp. As I pored over my journal, the pages rustled on their own. I looked up slowly to see a shadow slip across the wall, its shape vaguely human but distorted, as if seen through rippling water. I could swear it stopped right in front of me, a silent sentinel guarding the secrets of this ever-changing place. I reached out, trembling, to touch the wall, and felt a chill seep through my fingers, as if the surface were made of something cold and unyielding, not mere plaster. Now, even as I write these words, I can't help but wonder if I'm the only one who sees the truth. Every day, I live with the creeping terror that the world around me is not what it seems. I try to reassure myself that it's just my imagination, that my mind is playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know that what I'm experiencing is more than coincidence. It's as though something far darker has taken hold, rearranging the pieces of my reality when I'm not looking. I've moved out of that house now, into a small apartment in another part of town, hoping to escape the oppressive feeling that followed me. Yet sometimes, when the lights flicker or a door creaks, I can't help but think back to those inexplicable events. I lie awake at night, haunted by the possibility that I'm still being observed, that the changes were not confined to that one place. They may be happening all around me, hidden in plain sight, manipulated by a force I can neither comprehend nor escape. I share my story not because I want pity, but because I need to know I'm not the only one who's noticed that something in this world isn't quite right. Whether it's a trick of my mind or something far more sinister, the truth remains elusive. And as I continue to search for answers, I can't shake the lingering fear that I may be trapped in a reality that seems normal to everyone else, but is utterly alien and hostile to me. I always took the same train home after work, a routine that never failed to comfort me. One chilly autumn morning, as I boarded the train and settled into my usual window seat, I noticed something odd. The reflection in the window didn't quite match what was outside. A familiar face, an old friend I hadn't seen in years, appeared in the glass behind me, dressed in the exact outfit he wore on the day we lost touch. I blinked, and when I looked again, his image was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a quirk of my tired eyes, and I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than an insignificant glitch. But as the days passed, the small anomalies multiplied. On my daily walk to the office, I passed a little park where a bright red bench had always stood, worn smooth by countless passersby. Today, however, the bench was painted a deep, unsettling blue, its vibrant color clashing with the muted tones of autumn leaves. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, and even took a picture, but when I compared it with a photo from just a week ago, the bench was unmistakably different. I couldn't tell if it was a simple repainting or something more inexplicable. At work, things began to feel even stranger. I recalled a conversation I'd had with a colleague about a recent project, only to hear her recount an entirely different story when I mentioned it later. Her words felt familiar, yet out of sync with my memory, as though she were reciting a script I'd never heard before. In the cafeteria, I caught snippets of conversations repeating word for word, over and over, as if the same dialogue were looping in a continuous cycle. I started to wonder if I was trapped in some sort of surreal time loop, a malfunction in the very fabric of my daily existence. That evening, as I returned home, I entered my apartment and was struck by an unsettling sense of displacement. The bookshelf I had meticulously arranged by genre was now disordered, with a few books placed in entirely new positions. My favorite framed photograph, once hanging crookedly above the mantel, now sat perfectly aligned. Even the doorknob on my front door seemed different. No longer the familiar matte silver, but now a glossy chrome that caught the light in an almost too perfect way. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, as if the world I knew was being subtly rewritten before my eyes. I began to document these changes in a journal, writing down every minor discrepancy. The misplaced mug on the kitchen counter, the altered layout of my living room, even the way the streetlight outside my window flickered in an irregular pattern. Initially, these entries were a curious collection of oddities, things I could chalk up to my overactive imagination or a lapse in attention. But soon, the entries took on a more eerie tone. Some days, entire pages were missing, as if the moments I recorded were being erased, a gentle, imperceptible deletion of time and memory. Then came the day that shattered any remaining semblance of normality. I was in a small coffee shop I frequented every morning when I saw a woman I was certain I'd never met before. She wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and she sat quietly in a corner, her eyes fixed on something beyond the glass window. I felt a strong pull of recognition, an almost magnetic familiarity, even though nothing about her seemed to belong in my recollection. Later that day, while scrolling through my phone, I I discovered a message from an unknown number that read, "Everything is not as it seems." I couldn't tell if it was meant for me, or if it was simply part of the same inexplicable series of events. Over the following weeks, the glitches became as routine as my morning coffee. I began to notice that people I'd known for years started behaving in subtle, unsettling ways. A friend would say something that contradicted what he'd told me just the day before. Neighbors, whose routines were as predictable as clockwork, began to appear in places I was sure they never frequented. Even the layout of the streets seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if the city were rearranging its pieces like a jigsaw puzzle missing a few corners. I tried to confide in others about what I was experiencing, but my accounts were met with polite smiles and gentle reassurances that I was simply stressed or overworked. "You must be imagining things," they said. "Everything looks normal to me." But I knew better. Each day, my reality felt less and less like the one I'd once known. I started to feel as if I were living in a beta version of life, where familiar objects and people were mere placeholders in an ever-changing simulation. One night, after a particularly disconcerting day in which the same song played repeatedly on my car radio despite me switching stations multiple times, I sat alone in my darkened living room, staring at the flickering lamp above me. In that moment, the sense of repetition and inconsistency coalesced into an overwhelming realization. I might never return to the reality I once trusted. I felt a profound disconnect, as if the world around me were an elaborate facade, one that was slowly crumbling, glitch by glitch. The more I observed, the more I understood that I was no longer living in a static, reliable existence, but in a shifting matrix of half-remembered details and fractured memories. In that silent, oppressive darkness, I knew that I had become part of the glitch. I might always be aware of these subtle changes, always questioning whether the familiar was truly real or just another altered line in an endless loop of rewrites. The comforting normality I once took for granted was gone, replaced by a perpetual uncertainty that blurred the boundaries between truth and illusion. And with that realization, a cold dread settled over me. I had become trapped in a world where every moment could be different from what I remembered, and there was no going back to normal. I used to work the night shift at a small gas station off a quiet highway. It wasn't a bad job, mostly boring, with the occasional drunk customer or late-night trucker stopping in for coffee and cigarettes. The station itself was old, the kind of place that still had a handwritten ledger for deliveries and a radio that only picked up static after midnight. The fluorescent lights flickered sometimes, but that was just part of its charm. It wasn't until one particular night that I started to feel like something was truly wrong with that place. It was a little past 2 a.m. when I first noticed it. I had just finished stocking the cooler and stepped behind the counter to watch the security monitor. There were 4 feeds, one for the register area, one for the parking lot, one for the single gas pump outside, and one for the narrow storage room in the back. The parking lot was empty except for my car, and the gas pump sat unused under the dim glow of the overhead light. But something was off. On the farthest edge of the screen, just barely in frame, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the lot. They weren't moving, just standing there, just outside the reach of the lights. At first, I thought maybe it was someone from the trailer park down the road, but the longer I stared, the more I realized I couldn't make out any features. No clothes, no face, just a silhouette. I turned my head to look through the station's front window, expecting to see them standing there in real life, but there was nothing. The lot was empty. I glanced back at the monitor, still there. A chill ran through me. I swallowed and tapped the counter, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just a glitch in the camera. I'd seen weird reflections before. Sometimes bugs got too close to the lens, creating strange shadows. That had to be it. I looked back at the monitor. The figure was gone. I took a deep breath, forced to laugh, and rubbed my arms. I was tired, that was all. I had been pulling extra shifts lately, and exhaustion made people see things. I turned back to my routine, wiping down the coffee station and refilling the napkin dispenser. I didn't think about it again until the door's motion sensor chimed. I looked up, expecting to see a customer, but the door hadn't opened. It does that sometimes when the wind is strong, I told myself, but I glanced at the parking lot just to be sure. Still empty. That was when I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping from behind me. I froze. The storage room. I turned my head just enough to see the monitor. The camera for the storage room showed nothing. Just shelves lined with supplies and a broom leaning against the wall. I held my breath, waiting. The tap came again like fingernails against metal. I grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, an old box cutter from beneath the counter, and forced myself toward the storage room door. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I braced myself and yanked it open. Nothing. The room was completely empty. The metal shelves were undisturbed. No one was inside. The only thing out of place was the broom. It had fallen over. That had to be the noise, right? The broom? I exhaled a shaky breath and laughed at myself. I was being ridiculous. I picked up the broom and leaned it back into place. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something. The room smelled different. Not like dust or gasoline or stale coffee, but something sharper like burnt hair. I wrinkled my nose and stepped out, locking the storage room behind me. The rest of the night dragged on uneventfully. The occasional car rolled through, but nothing strange happened. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I had convinced myself it was all in my head. That is, until the next night. It started the same way. Quiet. Empty. The occasional static hum of the radio. Then, just before 2 a.m., the security monitor flickered. The figure was back. This time it was closer. It stood at the edge of the gas pump, just barely inside the light. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. It wasn't moving, but something about it was wrong. The shape seemed blurred, as if it weren't really there, but also somehow was. My skin prickled. I turned to look out the window. Nothing. When I looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. I locked the doors. The next few hours passed in heavy silence. I tried not to look at the monitors, tried not to listen too hard. But at 3:30 a.m., the chime rang again. The door didn't open, and this time I heard something else. Breathing. Not mine. It was close, just behind the counter, shallow and slow. My chest tightened. I turned my head, so slowly it hurt, my fingers tightening around the box cutter in my pocket. Nothing was there. The breathing stopped. I didn't finish my shift that night. I left at 4 a.m., locked the station, and sat in my car until my replacement showed up. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't know how. What was I supposed to say? That there was something standing outside the station that I could only see through a camera? That I'd heard someone breathing behind me even though no one was there? I didn't work night shifts after that. I switched to mornings, making sure I was never alone in that building again. I asked some of the other employees if they'd ever experienced anything strange. And while most said no, one older coworker, a guy named Rick, just gave me a long look. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Rick nodded to himself. "It happens sometimes," he said. "Never in the day. Just at night. You did the right thing not to stay." I wanted to ask more, but he wouldn't say anything else. I transferred to another station a few months later. I never went back. To this day, I don't know what I saw. A trick of the light? A glitch in the camera? A shadow of something that was never supposed to be there? I have no idea. But I do know one thing. If you ever work alone at night, pay attention to the cameras. Because sometimes they see things you don't. It began with a sense of déjà vu that I tried to ignore. Every evening, I returned to my apartment after work and found everything exactly as I'd left it. My favorite mug resting on the table, my keys neatly arranged on the counter, the old clock on the wall ticking steadily. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a comforting routine, a slice of normalcy in a hectic day. But then small anomalies started to accumulate. One night, as I sat watching TV, I glanced at the table and noticed the mug had shifted just a fraction, a tilt of the handle that I was sure hadn't been there before. I reached out and touched it. It was exactly as it always was, warm from the tea I'd poured earlier. Still, the subtle change sent a ripple of unease through me. The following day, during my commute on the bus, I found myself repeatedly glancing out the window. There, parked on the side of the road, was a black sedan. I distinctly remembered not seeing that car in the morning. Yet here it was again, its glossy surface reflecting the passing scenery, as if it had been waiting for me. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, perhaps a car that had been there all along, but deep down, I sensed a pattern emerging, one I couldn't quite explain. Returning home later, I discovered even more inexplicable repetitions. I had left a novel on the coffee table that I was certain I hadn't touched since the day before. Yet when I sat down, it lay open to the same page, as if someone had carefully placed it there after I'd been gone. I began to document these incidents, jotting down every small detail in a notebook. The more I recorded, the more I realized that these were not random events, but recurring glitches, a mysterious consistency in the midst of what should be a fluid, ever-changing world. At work, the phenomenon took on an even stranger form. I started noticing that during meetings, certain phrases or even gestures were repeated with eerie precision. A colleague would use the same inflection, a hand movement so synchronized with his previous actions it felt as if time had looped back on itself. I mentioned it to him once, but he merely laughed it off, saying I was overthinking things. Yet, in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the world was repeating itself in ways I couldn't control. One evening, I decided to test the pattern. I left my apartment exactly as usual, placing my mug in its rightful place on the table, and locked the door behind me. I took a series of photos of my living room, capturing every detail down to the scratches on the wooden floor. When I returned hours later, I compared the images on my phone. At first glance, everything looked identical, but upon closer inspection, I noticed a faint distortion at the edge of the table, a tiny ripple that hadn't been there before. It was as if reality had been edited ever so slightly, a glitch in an otherwise seamless video. The repeated appearances of that black sedan became a constant in my day. I saw it parked outside my building, reflected in the windows of passing shops, and even in the rearview mirror on a drive I couldn't recall taking. Its presence felt like a marker, a breadcrumb in a system that was slowly revealing its true nature. I began to wonder if I was caught in some sort of loop, a recursive sequence where every action I took was being recorded and replayed with minor alterations. As weeks passed, the glitches grew bolder. I found that conversations I was sure I had had would reoccur, word for word, at different times of the day. Friends would recount stories that I couldn't remember discussing, and my own recollections started to fragment. I began to suspect that my memories were not my own, but were being overwritten by some external force. Each repeated detail, every misplaced object and recurring encounter, started to feel like part of a vast, interconnected system, a system where I was no longer the master of my own narrative, but merely a variable in a colossal, incomprehensible equation. One cold, rainy night, I sat alone in my living room staring at the flickering streetlight outside. The black sedan passed by once more, its headlights momentarily illuminating my window, as if sending a silent message. In that moment, the weight of it all hit me. The familiar world I'd trusted, the predictable rhythm of my days, the comforting constancy of my surroundings was unraveling. The glitches were not random. They were systematic, deliberate adjustments to a reality that had become increasingly alien to me. I began to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the reality I knew was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion? What if every moment, every memory, was just a line of code in a program that was constantly being rewritten? The thought was both liberating and paralyzing. I could no longer tell if I was the observer of this glitch or an unwilling participant in it. The boundaries between my true self and the scripted existence around me blurred until they vanished entirely. Now, as I sit here, writing these words in the dim glow of a malfunctioning lamp, I feel the insidious pull of that relentless pattern. I realize that I may never escape the repetition, that the world as I once knew it might have been nothing more than a facade, an elaborate simulation in which I have become an intrinsic part of its glitch. I've come to accept that reality, with all its comforting certainties, might be fake, a program construct that defies logic and reason. And as that unsettling thought settles over me, I find myself wondering, does it even matter if I'm free, or if I've simply been coded into an endless loop of repeated moments, forever trapped in a world that is slowly eroding into nothingness? I first noticed him on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at the small neighborhood cafe I'd grown fond of. I was tucked into a corner seat with my laptop, savoring a quiet moment and a steaming cup of coffee, when I saw a man sitting at a table by the window. He was unremarkable, dressed in a plain coat, with neatly combed hair and a polite smile, but something about the way he studied the passers-by made me uneasy. I shrugged it off as a quirk of his personality. After all, the cafe was a popular spot and people watched the world go by in all sorts of ways. A few days later, as I was hurrying to catch the bus after work, I saw him again. This time he was leaning casually against the bus shelter, his eyes fixed on me as though he were expecting me to notice him. I forced a smile and pretended not to see, but a prickle of anxiety ran down my spine. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that in a small community, chance encounters were bound to happen. Yet, over the next week, the pattern only grew stranger. Every time I ventured out, whether stopping by the grocery store, taking a walk in the park, or even commuting on the local train, I caught glimpses of him. One morning, as I browsed in the produce aisle, I saw him at the far end, as if he were following the same shopping list as I was. Another time, while waiting at the bus stop during the twilight hours, I caught sight of his silhouette in the fading light, positioned at an angle that made it clear he wasn't there by chance. Each encounter left me with an unnerving sense of being observed, as if my daily routines were being cataloged by someone with a hidden agenda. At first, his approach was subtle. One afternoon at the park, I noticed him sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree. When I passed by, he casually greeted me with a nod and a soft, "Lovely day, isn't it?" His tone was friendly, but the way he looked at me, as if he were memorizing every detail, sent shivers down my spine. I tried to brush off the discomfort, thinking maybe I was just being overly cautious, but the unease persisted. Then came the conversations that began to blur the lines between coincidence and something more deliberate. While waiting in line at the corner store, he struck up a chat. "I see you're a fan of the local art exhibit," he remarked casually when he saw me glancing at a flyer on the bulletin board. I was startled. I hadn't even mentioned my interest in art before. Later, during another encounter at a bus stop, he asked, "Do you always take this route? I find it's the best way to catch the sunset." His words were benign enough, yet his tone held a familiarity that made it seem as though he already knew my schedule and habits. With each passing day, his presence became more intrusive. I began to notice small signs. An extra coffee cup left on a table at the cafe that wasn't mine, a discarded notebook on a park bench, and even a receipt for a purchase I distinctly remember not making. It was as if he were leaving breadcrumbs, pieces of a puzzle I didn't understand. I started to feel as though my every move was being documented, observed, and perhaps even orchestrated by someone I couldn't see fully, but who was always there, lurking on the periphery of my life. Emotionally, the effect was profound. I started to dread leaving my apartment, feeling that the familiar world was slowly being transformed into a stage for this silent, uninvited observer. Sleep became elusive, as every creak and rustle in the night was enough to send me into a state of hyper-alertness. I would wake up in cold sweats, convinced that I heard soft footsteps outside my door, only to find nothing when I mustered the courage to look. The line between reality and paranoia began to blur, and I found myself questioning if I was losing control over my own sense of safety. I tried to confide in a friend about what was happening. I recounted the odd coincidences, the subtle glances, and the strangely familiar questions that seemed to pry into the very details of my life. My friend listened with a concerned frown, but ultimately suggested that I was simply noticing someone who frequented the same places as I did. "People have routines, you know," she said gently. But her words did little to soothe the mounting dread I felt each time I saw his face in a crowd or caught him in a fleeting reflection on a shop window. One particularly disquieting evening, I was walking home along a dimly lit street when I heard footsteps that matched my pace exactly. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, just a few paces behind me. I quickened my steps, my heart pounding in my ears, but so did his. I could see the outline of his features in the murky light, his expression unreadable, almost as if he were waiting for me to turn the corner. I broke into a run, the cold air burning my lungs as I fled, not daring to look back until I was safely inside my locked apartment. Now, as I sit in the silence of my room, I can't shake the feeling that his presence lingers in the corners of my vision, that every shadow might conceal him waiting patiently. The meticulously normal face I once saw in the cafe now haunts my dreams, and the pattern of his appearances continues unabated. I am left with a gnawing question. Is this all a series of unsettling coincidences born from a restless mind, or am I truly being stalked by someone whose intentions remain shrouded in mystery? I share this story as both a warning and a confession. If you ever notice a stranger appearing in the same places you frequent, if you catch a glimpse of someone who seems to know more about you than they should, be wary. Because whether it's a twist of fate or the first sign of something far more sinister, I'm starting to believe that he might be following me, and that his next move could be just around the corner. I don't know when it started. At first, it was just little things, forgetting why I walked into a room, realizing I'd left my phone somewhere I was sure I hadn't been, small lapses in memory that felt normal. Everyone forgets things, right? But then it got worse. One night, I blinked and an hour was gone. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, and the clock read 9:42 p.m. The next time I looked up, it was 10:47. My phone was still in my hand, my TV still playing the same show, and yet I had no memory of that missing time. No text sent, no browser history opened. Just nothing. It happened again 2 nights later. This time, I was cooking dinner. I remember chopping vegetables, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board, the smell of garlic in the air. Then I was sitting at the kitchen table, an empty plate in front of me, my stomach full. I had no recollection of finishing the meal, cleaning up, or even sitting down. Just a cut in time, as if I had skipped forward in my own life. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, maybe some weird sleepwalking thing. But I never woke up in a different place. I never found signs that I had done something without realizing it. My body just continued while my mind went dark. I started keeping notes, tracking everything I did, hoping to catch some pattern, but all it did was make me more aware of how much I was missing. Pages in my journal would be filled with handwriting I didn't recognize, notes that felt foreign, like someone else had written them. You were here. It's fine. Don't ask. My own handwriting, but wrong. Too sharp, too deliberate. And then, the people around me started acting strange. One morning at work, my coworker Sarah smiled at me and said, "Hey, I like that story you told yesterday." I blinked. "What story?" She laughed. "You know, the one about the guy on the train? Super creepy. You had us all hanging on every word." I had never told a story about a guy on a train. That same day, my boss asked if I was feeling better. "For what?" I asked. He looked confused. "You were sick yesterday. You left early, remember?" But I didn't remember. I had been at work all day. I had emails sent, documents edited, even a coffee cup from the cafe down the street with the correct date on the receipt. But in everyone else's mind, I had left. It wasn't just work. Friends brought up conversations I had no memory of. My parents asked about plans I had never made. Even the barista at the cafe mentioned how I had looked so different the other day. "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know, just off. Quieter than usual. But you were in a rush, so maybe that's why." I hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. I tried setting up a camera in my apartment, desperate to catch myself doing something, anything, to explain the gaps. But every morning, the files were corrupted. Just static. No footy. It was as if something didn't want me to see. One night, I woke up standing in my bathroom. Not groggy, not mid-step, just standing, my hands gripping the edge of the sink, my face inches from the mirror. My own reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, pupils blown out like I had just been yanked out of a dream. I forced myself to move, to break whatever trance I was in, and I noticed my hands were wet. Not just damp, soaked, as if I had plunged them into ice water. The faucet wasn't running. There was no spilled water anywhere. Just my hands. I tried asking people directly, "Hey, do I seem different lately?" Most shrugged it off, saying I seemed distracted or tired. But one friend, Josh, paused for a little too long before answering. What? I pressed. What is it? He shook his head. Nothing. It's just sometimes you look at me like you don't know me. That hit me harder than it should have. I laughed it off, but that night I stood in front of the mirror again, staring at my own face. My reflection felt detached. I don't know how else to describe it. Like there was a split-second delay between my movements and the person in the mirror. I stopped sleeping properly. I was afraid I'd wake up somewhere new, or worse, someone new. Then came the voice. I was brushing my teeth, exhausted from another sleepless night, when I heard it, low, calm, whispering just behind my ear. Stop looking. I spun around so fast my vision blurred, but the bathroom was empty. I don't live alone. I checked my phone trying to distract myself, but my hands were shaking. That's when I noticed something even worse. I had a text message from my own number. It was just one word, tomorrow. I dropped my phone like it had burned me. I don't remember the rest of that night. I don't remember sleeping, don't remember turning off the lights. But when I woke up, my phone was gone. Not stolen, not misplaced, just gone. I searched everywhere. Under my bed, in the kitchen, even outside in the hallway. It wasn't in my apartment. It wasn't anywhere. And then, just as I was about to lose my mind, it rang. I nearly screamed. It was coming from the kitchen. I followed the sound, my heart hammering, and found it neatly placed on the counter. Face down, right next to a freshly poured glass of water. I hadn't poured any water. I picked up my phone with numb fingers and checked the call log. No missed calls. No incoming calls. But there was a new text. It's fine. No number. No sended. Just those two words. I should have left. Should have packed a bag and never looked back. But I was paralyzed. I felt like if I ran, whatever this was would follow. Now, weeks later, I still don't know what happened to me. I still feel off. Like I'm slipping between versions of myself. Like I'm sharing my body with something I don't understand. Sometimes, I'll look at my reflection and swear my lips almost move before I do. Sometimes, I wake up and my phone is in a different place. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is silent, I hear the voice again. Stop looking. So I don't. And I hope, God, I hope, that whatever is watching me is satisfied with that. It started on an ordinary Thursday. I had just returned from the grocery store, bags in hand, when I noticed something peculiar. A single glove lying on the sidewalk, abandoned as if its owner had vanished mid-stride. I picked it up, half expecting to find its missing mate soon, but no one came. I shrugged it off as a minor inconvenience, a stray object in an otherwise normal day. Yet that lone glove marked the beginning of an unsettling series of events that would soon upend my sense of reality. Over the following days, subtle oddities began to accumulate. I'd leave my apartment one morning only to find items inexplicably rearranged upon my return. A book placed neatly on the coffee table would appear on a shelf the next day, and sometimes a familiar postcard would materialize on my desk with no explanation. At first, I dismissed these as tricks of a tired mind, mere coincidences to be rationalized away. But then the anomalies took on a more disturbing quality. At work, colleagues began behaving in ways that defied explanation. During a routine meeting, I mentioned a minor incident in the break room, a spilled cup of coffee, and was met with blank stares and polite nods, as if nothing had occurred. Later, a co-worker recounted the incident with details that clashed with my own recollection, leaving me to question whether I had misremembered the event. I started to wonder if I was slowly losing my grip on what was real. Things grew stranger still. One evening on my way home, I noticed a man I didn't recognize standing on a corner, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I tried to return his gaze, he quickly averted his eyes, as though afraid of being seen. The next day, I passed that same corner, but the man had vanished entirely. Yet the memory of his gaze lingered, and the brief encounter left me unnerved. It wasn't long before further discrepancies emerged. I began observing that people around me seemed to forget events that had just transpired. Friends would resume conversations as if entire moments had been erased from their memories. A neighbor I chatted with over the fence insisted he hadn't seen the strange car parked outside his house the night before, even though I was sure I had noticed it. More disconcerting were the instances when I caught glimpses of people subtly shifting. A change in the color of a shirt here, a slight alteration in a smile there. These weren't drastic transformations, but tiny details that made me question whether those around me were being rewritten by forces beyond their or my control. The most troubling part was the sensation of being a bystander in my own life. I began feeling as though I were watching events unfold from a distance, as if someone else were controlling the narrative. Even my own actions felt scripted. I would set my alarm and go about my morning routine, yet an odd disconnect nagged at me, a sense that I wasn't fully present. Desperate for some anchor to my reality, I started documenting every strange occurrence in a journal, hoping that the written word might preserve my memories against a tide of inexplicable alterations. Late one night, as I sat at my desk under the weak glow of a lamp, I reread my journal entries and was struck by a disturbing realization. Events on one page contradicted those on the next, as if time itself were being edited. Gaps between entries lengthened, and moments once dismissed as trivial now pulsed with a disquieting significance. I began to wonder if the universe were subtly altering reality, erasing fragments of the past while rewriting others, leaving me stranded in a narrative that I no longer controlled. Now, as I type these words, the soft hum of my computer and the ticking of the clock are my only anchors in a reality that feels increasingly fluid and unreliable. I can no longer trust my own recollections. Every conversation, every fleeting glance, every misplaced object raises more questions than it answers. The world around me seems like a carefully constructed stage, and I feel nothing more than an actor forced to follow a script I never wrote. I searched desperately for a rational explanation, proof that these events are real and not the product of a mind unraveling under pressure. But every clue slips away like fragments of a half-remembered dream. In the weeks that followed, the phenomena escalated in ways that defied all logic. I found myself questioning not only my memories, but those of the people I once trusted. One evening, while having dinner with a close friend, I mentioned the lost glove incident. She listened intently, then, to my shock, insisted she hadn't heard of any such occurrence. When I pressed her further, her face drained of color, and her eyes darted nervously as if she feared speaking the truth. It was then that I realized I was no longer alone in my disquiet. Something was seeping into the very fabric of our shared reality, altering perceptions and erasing events as though they had never happened. As days turned into nights, the boundary between past and present blurred. I began receiving calls from unknown numbers, only to be met with silence or voices distorted into unintelligible whispers. Once, in the midst of an uneventful afternoon, a coworker called to insist she was at home, despite my clear memory of her joining me at the office that morning. Each incident chipped away at my certainty, leaving me adrift in a shifting world where memory itself seemed expendable. Even my reflection became suspect. In windows and mirrors, I occasionally caught a glimpse of a figure behind me, a fleeting, sorrowful face that vanished when I turned. At other moments, ambient voices seemed to murmur my name, drawing me into half-formed conversations that left me questioning whether I was truly present. The world, it seemed, was a stage of ceaseless change, its script being rewritten minute by minute. Now, in the quiet solitude of these restless nights, I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the next minute will bring clarity or plunge me further into this labyrinth of inexplicable change. Am I losing my mind, or is there a force at work rewriting the very fabric of reality? The missing glove, the altered memories, the shifting faces, all serve as unsettling reminders that something is amiss. I remain, in uncertainty, a witness to a world in flux, and I fear that the true extent of what is happening may never be fully revealed. I first noticed something was off the day I met Lucas. I just started a new job at a small design firm, and everything felt fresh until I encountered him in the building's narrow corridor. He was standing by the water cooler, dressed in a charcoal suit that somehow felt too formal for a Monday morning. I greeted him politely, and he offered a slow, enigmatic smile that sent a shiver down my spine. At the time, I chalked it up to first-day nerves and the oddity of a new workplace, but that smile stayed with me. The next few days were a blur of meetings and design briefs, but amidst the routine, I began noticing small glitches. One afternoon, I left my office for a coffee break, and when I returned, my desk had been rearranged in a way I was sure I hadn't approved. My favorite mug, always perched on the right side, now sat on the left, its bright blue color clashing with the otherwise neutral decor. I mentioned it casually to a coworker, but they assured me nothing had changed. My desk, my belongings, even the layout of the room remained exactly as they'd been yesterday. I felt a twinge of unease but pushed it aside as a simple mistake. Then there was Lucas. I began to see him everywhere, in the lobby, by the elevators, even in the reflection of the glass doors at lunch. Each time, his appearance was slightly different. One day his eyes were a piercing blue, the next they were a dull gray. His hair, usually slicked back, would sometimes fall in loose strands around his face. And though I swore it was the same person, his mannerisms would shift ever so subtly, as if he were playing different roles in a never-ending performance. At first, I assumed I was simply overanalyzing details out of nervousness, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at my sense of reality. Time, too, began to behave oddly. I started losing hours without knowing where they went. One evening, I sat down to read a book, and after what felt like mere minutes, glanced up at the clock only to find that nearly 3 hours had passed. The pages of my journal, the one I kept to track these strange events, sometimes appeared half erased, as if someone had come through the night and removed fragments of my recorded memories. I tried to piece together the timeline, but it was as if reality itself was rewriting the narrative, leaving me uncertain of what truly happened. One rainy Thursday, I encountered Lucas again on my way home. I recognized him immediately. He was leaning against the awning outside a bus stop, his expression blank. I walked past him, but when I looked back, he was following me at a distance. His presence felt almost magnetic, pulling my attention to details I'd never noticed before. The way the streetlights flickered in sync with distant thunder, or how reflections in puddles warped the cityscape into surreal images. My heartbeat accelerated, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being guided through a scene I had seen many times before, yet could never fully recall. Later that night, while I sat in my dim apartment trying to sort through the jumble of altered memories and inexplicable hours, I found an old photograph tucked into a book on my shelf. It was a candid shot of me in the very hallway where I'd first met Lucas, taken from an angle I didn't recognize. The image was blurred at the edges, and in the background, a faint figure, Lucas, seemed to merge with the shadows. My hands trembled as I stared at it, and for the first time, I felt that these anomalies were not just isolated incidents, but part of a larger, incomprehensible tapestry. I began to doubt everything I once trusted about my world. The people around me spoke with the same familiar voices, yet their words sometimes carried odd cadences, as if they were reciting lines from a script I had never learned. Objects in my apartment would move ever so slightly when I wasn't looking, and even my own recollections felt unstable, as if the past was shifting before my eyes. I documented every glitch, every moment that defied logic. But the more I recorded, the more my notes became fragmented, like scattered pieces of a puzzle with no clear picture. Now, as I sit in the pale glow of my laptop, reviewing what I've scribbled down in countless notebooks, I can't help but feel that I've become part of something far larger than myself, a glitch in the matrix of reality. Lucas's appearances, the lost hours, the inexplicable rearrangements of my world, they all point to one unsettling possibility, that nothing is as it seems. My life, my memories, even the people I once trusted might all be mere variables in a cosmic experiment gone awry. I no longer know if I'm the observer or the observed, if I'm controlling my fate or being manipulated by forces beyond comprehension. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the line between wakefulness and dreams blurs, I fear that the reality I once knew is irretrievably lost, replaced by a shifting illusion I can never escape. I always took the same train home after work, a routine that had never failed to comfort me. One chilly October evening, as I boarded the nearly empty car and settled into my usual seat by the window, something caught my eye. Across the aisle sat a man who looked exactly like my best friend from college, Adam. Except this Adam was different. His eyes were blank, his smile fixed and strangely out of place, as if he were performing a role. I waved, expecting him to nod or speak, but he merely stared ahead, his face unchanging. I dismissed it as a trick of the dim, overhead light and chalked it up to a lapse in memory, since Adam had moved away years ago. Yet the image of that vacant, uncanny smile would haunt me for days. The next morning, I awoke to find my apartment subtly altered. At first, it was a minor detail. The bookshelf in the living room, which I had meticulously arranged by color, now held the books in a completely different order. I distinctly remembered arranging them the night before. I questioned my sanity. Had I been sleepwalking? But when I reached for the same book later that day, its position had inexplicably shifted once more. I scoured the apartment, checking every room, and even noticed that the doorknob on my front door, usually a dull matte finish, now shone with a polished gleam. I felt a chill as a gnawing sense of unreality set in. Was my world simply rearranging itself, or was something else at work? Determined to make sense of these small anomalies, I began to document every change. I took photos, wrote down details, and even set up a camera in my living room. Yet each time I reviewed the footage, the images were inconclusive. A momentary flicker here, a shadow there, nothing that definitively explained the rearrangements. It was as if the apartment was glitching, momentarily rebooting itself, with fragments of a familiar life replaced by subtle, yet unsettling differences. As the days turned into weeks, the strange events grew more pronounced. One evening, while making dinner, I noticed that the kitchen clock, which had always ticked steadily, had suddenly frozen at 8:37. I stared at it, heart pounding, until it resumed ticking as though nothing had happened. But later that night, I received a text message from my sister asking if I had attended a family dinner the previous evening, a dinner I was sure I'd missed. My mind raced. Had I somehow been transported into an alternate version of my own day? The feeling of repetition soon intensified. I began to experience eerie déjà vu, moments where I was convinced I had already lived through the same conversation, the same route to work, even the same fleeting glance with a stranger on the street. Each time I tried to correct these anomalies, the world around me responded with subtle alterations. My favorite coffee mug, which I always left on the counter, would appear in a different spot when I returned to the kitchen. A painting on the wall would slowly rotate, its subject shifting imperceptibly between two nearly identical scenes. I could no longer trust my own recollections. Late one night, as I sat in my dimly lit living room scrutinizing the journal I kept of these events, a sound made me jump. It was a soft, almost imperceptible hum, like that of static on an old television, emanating from the corner of the room. I turned, and in that brief moment, the room seemed to ripple, as if reality itself were buffering. I blinked, and the hum vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. But the feeling remained, an overwhelming sense that my life was not entirely my own, that some unseen force was rewriting the script of my days. I attempted to discuss these experiences with friends, but each time I did, they offered polite smiles and reassurances that I must be overworked or imagining things. One friend even joked, "Maybe you're stuck in a loop, man, like a bad computer glitch." His words, meant in jest, only deepened my unease. The more I pressed for an explanation, the more the conversation turned evasive, as if they too had caught a glimpse of something unspoken, something that defied ordinary explanation. Then one rainy evening, it happened again. I was walking home under the dim glow of streetlights when I suddenly encountered Adam. Real Adam, the friend I thought had vanished years ago, standing at the bus stop. He looked at me with familiar eyes, but his expression was clouded by a sorrow I couldn't place. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, before turning and disappearing into the rain. I stood there, drenched and shivering, unable to process what I had just witnessed. Was he warning me, or was he simply another casualty of this inexplicable phenomenon? Now, Every moment feels unstable. I find myself questioning whether I am experiencing a series of coincidences or if reality is, in fact, glitching, rewriting itself piece by piece. Each day, familiar faces and places seem to shift imperceptibly, leaving me isolated in a world that appears normal to everyone else, but which I now know is fundamentally broken. I am trapped in a cycle of repetition and distortion, unable to distinguish between what is real and what has been altered. The unsettling certainty that something is wrong with the fabric of our reality lingers at every corner of my mind. I can't tell if I have become part of a larger experiment, or if the world itself has fractured into countless unreliable streams of existence. All I know is that every time I blink, every time I look away and back, there's the lingering possibility that reality might have changed again, leaving me forever questioning whether I am the one in control or merely another glitch in a broken matrix. I moved into the small brick apartment in early October, thinking a change of scenery would be a welcome break from the chaos of city life. The building sat on a quiet street where every house had a story, yet none of the neighbors mentioned anything out of the ordinary. My first days were uneventful, unpacking boxes, setting up a modest workspace, and taking long walks in the nearby park that smelled of damp leaves and impending winter. The building's creaks and groans seemed like nothing more than an old structure settling into its bones. I attributed the occasional flicker of a hallway light to faulty wiring and shrugged off the whisper of wind as it wove through narrow gaps in the window frames. A week into my new life, however, small oddities began to surface. I noticed that items weren't quite where I remembered leaving them. A cup on the counter now positioned on the bookshelf, a framed photograph that had inexplicably rotated on the wall. I rationalized these as absent-minded errors on my part, convinced that exhaustion and stress from the move were playing tricks on my memory. Yet, each evening, as I returned from a walk under a sky heavy with clouds, a peculiar unease settled over me. It wasn't until one rainy night that I truly felt the difference. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I distinctly heard the soft sound of footsteps pacing outside my door. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening to the measured rhythm. When the sound paused, so did my heart, but when I dared to open the door just a crack, I saw nothing but a narrow, dimly lit corridor. Determined to find a logical explanation, I began a meticulous investigation. I installed a couple of motion-activated cameras in the living room and hallway, convinced that if someone was sneaking in, I would capture evidence. On reviewing the footage, my skepticism turned to disquiet. One camera recorded a shadowy figure gliding along the corridor at an odd hour. The image was blurry, and the figure's face was indistinct, but I swear its eyes caught the light with an unnatural gleam. I spent hours analyzing every frame, trying to detect signs of a trick of the light or a malfunction. Nothing explained it away. The rational part of my mind insisted I was overreacting. I began scouring online forums, typing up every detail in hopes of finding someone who'd experienced a similar phenomenon. Some responses were dry dismissals, yet a few others echoed my own growing fears. One user mentioned a legend about the original tenants of the building, a family torn apart by grief and loss, leaving behind a lingering sorrow that seeped into the walls. I dug into the local archives and found a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman with penetrating eyes and a solemn expression. Her presence in that photograph stirred something inside me. Could it be that her spirit was the one I'd glimpsed in the recordings? I searched the files for any record of her story, but found nothing concrete, only hints in the margins of forgotten newspaper clippings. As autumn deepened, the inexplicable events intensified. Late one night, I awoke to the sound of soft, urgent whispers. They were disjointed, as if someone were reciting fragments of a long-forgotten prayer. I recorded the sounds, only to be met with a low, almost imperceptible hum when I played them back. On another occasion, I discovered a note slipped under my door, written in a shaky hand. They watch from the dark corners. I clutched the note, trying to decipher its meaning. Were these simply random acts of vandalism, or was someone or something trying to communicate with me? I confided in a couple of friends, showing them the recordings and the note, but their rational reassurances did little to ease my anxiety. One friend suggested I was experiencing stress-induced hallucinations, a byproduct of the isolation and the relentless creep of nighttime shadows. Yet every day, the occurrences grew harder to ignore. A chill would settle in my bones in the middle of the day. The familiar hum of the refrigerator would be overlaid with a strange, distant murmur. And on several evenings, as I looked out the window, I saw what appeared to be a pale figure drifting silently across the street before vanishing into the darkness. I began keeping a detailed journal of every unexplained moment. My entries grew longer and more frantic as I recorded the bizarre coincidences and odd sensations. I spent hours poring over the evidence, attempting to stitch together a logical narrative. But the more I tried to explain, the more the inexplicable defied my understanding. It seemed that every answer birthed new questions. Was it possible that the building itself was a vessel for memories and energies that spanned beyond time? Or was I inadvertently disturbing a presence that had lain dormant, waiting for someone to notice? Tonight, as I write these words by the faint glow of a desk lamp, I find myself at the edge of certainty and madness. The shadows in the corners of my vision seem to pulse with intent, and even the rhythmic ticking of the clock sounds like a countdown to something unfathomable. I have yet to uncover a concrete explanation, and with every attempt to document the strange events, I only seem to draw them closer. I have shared my story with online communities, but their skepticism only deepens my isolation. What if what I'm experiencing isn't a figment of my imagination, but a truth too monstrous for common belief? I leave you with these questions, unresolved and echoing in the silence of my apartment. What is the nature of the presence that seems so intent on communicating with me? Is it merely an echo of a sorrowful past, or a harbinger of something far darker? And why does every rational explanation crumble before the sheer weight of these inexplicable events? As I prepare for another night haunted by distant footsteps and disembodied whispers, I can't help but wonder if my quest for logical answers has only paved the way for an encounter with the truly unfathomable. I moved into a modest apartment on the edge of town with the hope of finding a quieter life, a place where the simple rhythm of daily routines would drown out the chaos of my past. In the first few weeks, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I brewed my morning coffee, read on the small balcony, and strolled through the nearby park where autumn leaves crunched underfoot. Yet, small anomalies began to occur that I initially dismissed as quirks of an old building or the result of fatigue. A book misplaced from my shelf here, a door that wouldn't latch there, or the occasional sound of a distant laugh echoing in empty corridors. All trivial moments that could easily be chalked up to coincidence. One evening after a long day at work, I returned to find the lamp in the living room switched off, despite having left it on when I departed. I assumed it was a power surge or simply a lapse in my memory. The next morning, my keys were missing from their usual bowl, only to be discovered later on the kitchen counter as if placed there by an unseen hand. I started to question my own recollection, wondering if stress or exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But as the days passed, these harmless incidents multiplied. Faces in the neighborhood began to appear strangely familiar, as though I'd seen them before even though I had no recollection of meeting them. A neighbor I exchanged pleasantries with seemed to know my name, and a passerby's smile hinted at a shared secret that I couldn't decipher. The unsettling events escalated gradually. One rainy afternoon, while gazing through the window, I heard a soft, melancholic melody drifting through the air. The tune, reminiscent of a lullaby from my childhood, carried an inexplicable sadness. I tried recording it on my phone, but the playback revealed only static. Soon after, objects in my apartment started to vanish and then reappear in different places. A cherished photograph of a dear friend disappeared from its frame, only to be found later on the bookshelf, its position altered as if deliberately moved. I jotted down every detail in a worn journal, desperate to piece together a logical explanation for what I was experiencing. At night, My sleep was haunted by unsettling visions. In the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I sometimes caught a glimpse of a figure in the reflection of my mirror, a fleeting shadow that vanished when I turned around. Soft whispers filled the silence of my room, their words indistinct but laced with urgency. I began to wonder if these experiences were merely the byproducts of an overtaxed mind or something more sinister. I mentioned these occurrences to friends and even a sympathetic neighbor, yet they all insisted it was my imagination running wild. Their reassurances only deepened my own doubts. I grew increasingly uncertain of what was real. Every misplaced item, every inexplicable sound, and every familiar face that I was sure I had never met before began to blur the line between reality and illusion. Was I the victim of a subtle, orchestrated intrusion into my life? Or was my perception simply crumbling under the weight of isolation and stress? I started scrutinizing my every move, fearful that each moment might be another carefully staged act in a performance I couldn't comprehend. Now, as I sit in the quiet darkness of my apartment and listen to the soft creaks of the building settling around me, I cannot tell if these experiences are genuine manifestations of something beyond our understanding or just the fragments of a mind under duress. Every sound, every shadow, and every inexplicable shift in my surroundings fills me with a profound uncertainty. I record these moments in hopes that they might one day lead to an explanation. Yet with each passing day, the anomalies multiply, leaving me to wonder if I'm slowly unraveling. Is there an unseen force manipulating my reality, or have I simply lost my grip on what is real? I can no longer tell if the gentle hum in the hallway, the reappearing photograph, or that all too familiar face in the crowd are signs of something sinister or merely the product of my imagination. The questions remain unanswered, suspended in the silence of my lonely nights, and I am left to wonder if what I have experienced is the truth or nothing more than a haunting illusion. I first noticed him on a crisp autumn evening as I trudged home from a late shift. I had only moved into the building a few weeks prior, still adjusting to the anonymity of a new city. At first, his presence was hardly remarkable. A quiet nod in the hallway, a soft good evening as I fumbled with my keys. His name, as I later learned, was Darren. In the dim glow of the corridor's lights, he seemed like any other neighbor, reserved yet polite, his smile kind but fleeting. I never suspected that beneath that gentle veneer lay something far more unsettling. Over the next several days, however, small details began to intrude upon my sense of normalcy. Darren's casual inquiries, initially dismissed as neighborly concern, gradually took on a disquieting intensity. One afternoon, while I was waiting for the elevator, he asked in a tone that bordered on interrogative, "So, what time do you usually leave for work?" His question, seemingly innocuous on its own, made my skin prickle as if I'd unwittingly exposed a private schedule. On another occasion, he complimented the cut of my jacket with such precise admiration that it felt less like a friendly remark and more like an appraisal of my every detail. I told myself that he was simply an overly curious soul, but the frequency and focus of his observations began to gnaw at me. I started encountering him in unexpected places. At the local grocery store, I would catch a glimpse of his face in the produce aisle, as though he had purposefully positioned himself to observe my every move. One rainy evening, while waiting for a bus beneath a flickering street lamp, I saw him leaning casually against a lamppost. His eyes tracked me as I walked past. His gaze was uncomfortably steady, as if he were absorbing every nuance of my appearance. Each encounter left me with a lingering chill, a sense that I was being silently documented by someone who should not be so interested in the minutiae of my life. The turning point came on a drab afternoon when I discovered a small, unmarked note slipped under my apartment door. The paper was plain, nothing extravagant or decorative about it, but the message was disturbingly clear. "I know your routine." My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at those 4 chilling words. The note, unsigned and unadorned by any hint of humor or malice, instead radiated an eerie calm. I found myself scanning the corridor for Darren's familiar figure, but he was nowhere in sight. Still, The sense of exposure and vulnerability clung to me like a shadow. At work, the signs of his overweening interest continued unabated. A casual hallway chat turned into a barrage of personal questions that made small talk seem invasive. Darren's comments about my lunch break or the route I took home were too detailed, too specific, as though he were following me or worse, monitoring my every move. When I attempted to laugh off his queries and change the subject, I caught a fleeting glimpse of something hard and calculating behind his friendly eyes. A subtle shift that left me questioning whether his intentions were benign or something more predatory. One particularly unsettling evening, as I was leaving the office, I saw him again. This time he was standing at the far end of the building's courtyard, illuminated by the harsh glare of a street lamp. He watched me intently, his expression unreadable. For a moment, our eyes met, and in that brief connection, I felt a surge of terror, so potent that I nearly stopped in my tracks. It was then I realized that the small, intrusive gestures, the uncanny compliments, and the calculated questions were not isolated quirks of personality. They were parts of a pattern, a slow but deliberate attempt to assert control over my life. Now, as I sit alone in my apartment reviewing these unsettling memories, the line between paranoia and genuine danger has become blurred. I have taken to double-checking locks, altering my routes, and even changing my routine entirely in a desperate bid to reclaim a sense of safety. Yet no matter how I adjust, the nagging fear remains that Darren's friendly facade might hide a darker motive. I have discussed my concerns with a few acquaintances, but their dismissive reassurances only add to my isolation. They see nothing more than an eccentric neighbor. I see an ever-watchful presence whose compliments and casual inquiries feel like the preliminary acts of a script I never agreed to play. I write these words now with trembling hands and a mind fraught with uncertainty. Was Darren's behavior merely a quirk of an overly inquisitive soul, or did his subtle displays of control hint at something far more dangerous? The evidence is as ambiguous as it is unsettling. A series of small, seemingly harmless encounters that now, in retrospect, carry the weight of forewarning. I remain trapped in a state of hypervigilance, uncertain if I am simply overreacting to an unusual personality or if I am being slowly ensnared by someone whose true nature I have yet to uncover. Even as I try to sleep, every creak of the floorboards and every shadow flickering past my window raises the question. Could he be anywhere, watching, waiting for his next move? And as the night deepens, I can't help but wonder if my escalating anxiety is a product of my own mind, or a response to a very real, very present threat. I never believed that my life could turn into a nightmare until the events of last autumn shattered every semblance of normalcy I once clung to. It began with subtle anomalies, a misplaced book on a shelf, a creak in the dead of night, and fleeting glimpses of movement just beyond my line of sight. At first, I dismissed these occurrences as tricks of an overactive mind, the byproducts of isolation in an aging apartment building whose history was as faded as its peeling wallpaper. But soon, the inexplicable intensified, and I began to sense that something else resided within these walls. Late one evening, after a long, draining day at work, I returned home to find the corridor bathed in a ghostly, wavering light. The hum of the overhead lamp pulsed in time with my racing heartbeat. As I ascended the narrow staircase, each creaking step echoed like a whispered warning. In the tarnished reflection of a cracked mirror hanging in the hallway, I saw, for a split second, a figure standing directly behind me, a silhouette too vague to be human, yet too distinct to ignore. When I spun around, there was nothing but the empty, oppressive silence and a chill that foretold impending doom. In the days that followed, the disturbances grew bolder. At night, soft, deliberate whispers slithered through the halls, speaking in a language foreign to my ears. Objects shifted positions inexplicably, and one morning I awoke to find my bedroom door ajar despite having locked it the night before. The building itself seemed to harbor secrets, its walls breathing an ancient malevolence. Driven by equal measures of terror and curiosity, I ventured into the basement, a place I had long avoided. There, concealed behind a heavy, dust-laden door, I discovered a room frozen in time. Inside that hidden chamber, the air was ice-cold and thick with the scent of decay. The walls were adorned with intricate murals depicting shadowy figures entwined in arcane rituals, their hollow eyes filled with silent accusation. At the room's center, resting on a rickety wooden table, lay a leather-bound journal. Its brittle pages were filled with cryptic entries and eerie sketches that mirrored the figures from the murals. The writing spoke of forbidden ceremonies intended to breach the veil between our world and a darker realm, a realm that hungered for lost souls. Each word sent shivers racing down my spine, binding me to a fate I could neither understand nor escape. Since that fateful night, my existence has been a relentless battle against an unseen force. Shadows writhe at the edge of my vision, and the soft tapping on my window at midnight has become an ominous ritual. I have tried to confide in friends, but their polite dismissals and forced smiles only deepen my isolation. Each night, I lie awake to the building's murmurs and creaks, haunted by the relentless whisper of secrets meant for no living ear. Every morning, I awaken with an unnameable sorrow, as if a part of me were forever lost in that accursed room. Now, as I write these words by the flickering glow of a solitary lamp, an overwhelming sense of being watched gnaws at my sanity. The temperature in my room drops without warning, and the silence is punctuated by distant, echoing footsteps that are not my own. A slow, deliberate knock at my door, measured and unyielding, reminds me that the forces I have disturbed are patient and inevitable. I fear that the boundary between our world and the darkness beyond has been irreparably weakened, and that soon, the true nightmare will break free. Even now, as I sit with trembling hands in the dim glow of my study, I cannot shake the unsettling feeling that every shadow hides a secret and every silence conceals the echo of a forgotten horror. The boundaries between the living and the dead, between the known and the unfathomable, have blurred irreparably. I dread the hour when those forces, stirred by my unwitting intrusion, will rise to claim what they have long coveted. My only hope is that this record endures as both a warning and a testament to the peril of tampering with the unknown. May you heed these words and never venture too close to the edge of darkness, for once you glimpse the abyss, there is no returning to the light. As I finish this final entry, I feel a cold hand brush my shoulder, a silent promise that my torment is far from over. I moved into my new apartment last fall, a modest two-bedroom unit in an old brick building on a quiet suburban street. The move was supposed to be a fresh start after a tumultuous few years, and at first everything felt perfectly normal. I remember the day vividly. The crisp autumn air, the sound of the moving truck in the distance, the smell of fresh paint mixed with old memories. I spent days arranging my belongings, meticulously placing each item where I thought it belonged. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, on the third night, I noticed something small. I had left my favorite armchair by the window, a comfortable spot I'd chosen for reading. When I returned from a late shift, however, the chair was not there. I searched the living room and even peeked into the hallway. It was as if the chair had vanished into thin air. I assumed I must have moved it in my sleep or forgotten placing it down. I shrugged it off and went to bed, trying to convince myself that exhaustion was to blame. The next morning brought another oddity. On the kitchen table lay a folded note in neat handwriting that read, "Welcome home." I was certain I hadn't written it, nor had I seen anyone else in the apartment building that early. At first, I thought it might have been left by the previous tenant or perhaps even a well-meaning neighbor, but no one would later confirm such a detail. Over the next few days, the anomalies multiplied. I would return from work to find everyday objects slightly displaced. A lamp moved from its usual spot to the center of the dining table. A set of books that I'd organized on the shelf now stacked haphazardly on the coffee table. I began to keep a journal, noting every inexplicable change. The entries were filled with minor details. Tuesday, 7:15 p.m., armchair still missing from by the window. Found it today near the doorway in the hall. Or Thursday, 8 a.m., Coffee mug from the counter now appears to be on the table, though I distinctly placed it elsewhere. At first, I thought these were isolated incidents, perhaps products of my own forgetfulness or the natural shifting of objects over time. But soon, the changes became too consistent to ignore. One evening, I returned home after a particularly draining day and found my living room altered in a way that unsettled me deeply. The sofa, which I was sure had always faced the television, was now angled toward the door. A mirror that hung above the fireplace was slightly tilted, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I stood there, heart pounding, questioning whether I was losing my grip on reality. I called a friend to describe the changes, only to be met with a hesitant suggestion that maybe I was simply more tired than I realized. Then came the most disturbing incident. I was in my bedroom, getting ready for bed, when I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the mirror. For a fleeting second, I saw not my own face, but a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The lights were on, every door locked, every window closed. My pulse raced as I realized that this wasn't just a misinterpretation of shadows. It was something more, something that didn't belong. As the days turned into weeks, the subtle glitches began to feel like part of a much larger system. I started noticing that certain events repeated themselves almost identically, as if I were stuck in a loop. I would leave my apartment at a specific time and return later to find things arranged in an exact pattern from the previous day, despite my conscious effort to change them. The hallway outside my door would look slightly different depending on the time I passed through it, the wallpaper's pattern seeming to shift imperceptibly. Even conversations with neighbors fell off. One person, a kindly older man I'd exchanged greetings with countless times, one day remarked, "I can't remember if we've spoken before," his tone laced with an eerie uncertainty that mirrored my own growing dread. I began to suspect that I was not merely forgetting details. Something was actively rewriting the familiar. Late at night, while trying to fall asleep, I would replay the day's events in my mind, only to find discrepancies. Moments I was sure I had experienced were missing, as if time itself had been edited out. I recalled a conversation with my friend Sarah over the phone where we laughed about my new place. Yet later, when I mentioned it to another friend, they insisted that Sarah had never called me at all that week. My journal entries, once clear and coherent, began to contradict themselves, the dates and times overlapping in ways that defied logic. One particularly unnerving night, I woke to find my door slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it before bed. I approached it cautiously, heart hammering, and peered into the dim hallway. The corridor stretched on, unnaturally long and unlit, a stark contrast to the warm, familiar space I'd known for months. In that moment, a profound realization struck me. The apartment I had come to know was no longer stable, no longer a constant. It was as if the very fabric of my reality was being reassembled piece by piece, with every small detail subject to change. Now, as I sit alone in the quiet of my apartment, I feel an overwhelming sense of dislocation. Every time I turn a corner or open a door, I brace myself for the unexpected. A rearranged piece of furniture, an altered layout, or a message scrawled on a wall that wasn't there before. I've started to wonder if I've stumbled into some kind of closed loop, an alternate reality where nothing remains constant. The changes are too precise, too methodical to be random. They whisper of a design, a hidden system that controls every minute detail of my surroundings. I'm beginning to fear that my life, the memories I cling to, the comfort of the known, might all be nothing more than an illusion, a programmed facade. With each passing day, the line between what is real and what is fabricated blurs further until I can no longer trust my senses. I confront the unsettling possibility that I have become part of this anomaly, a pawn in a perpetual loop of rearranged moments and altered realities. And as I stare at the familiar, yet ever-changing layout of my home, I cannot help but wonder if it even matters anymore. If the truth of my existence is merely a glitch in an elaborate system from which there may be no escape. I used to think my life was ordinary, until the day everything began to unravel from the inside out. It started with the small things, moments when I'd be walking down the street or sitting in a meeting and suddenly feel as if time had skipped a beat, as if I'd lost precious minutes I couldn't account for. At first, I blamed it on exhaustion from long hours at work or the stress of juggling responsibilities. But soon, it became clear that something far more unsettling was happening. One morning, I woke up disoriented, with an ache in my head and a gnawing feeling that I'd missed part of the night. I checked my phone. There were no missed calls, no messages that could explain my blank spaces of memory. I tried to retrace my steps in my mind, but every attempt ended in a murky haze of lost time. At work, I found that colleagues mentioned events and conversations that I was sure never happened. During a team meeting, one coworker casually remarked, "I can't believe you did that yesterday," as if my actions were scripted in a way I couldn't remember. I nodded awkwardly, desperate to piece together the fragments of my day, yet every recollection felt alien. The most disturbing changes, however, began to emerge in my own behavior. I would catch fleeting glimpses of myself in reflective surfaces, on a car window, in a shop display, in the polished metal of an elevator. And sometimes, in those brief moments, I'd see a version of me that wasn't my own, a face with eyes too distant, a smile that didn't match my inner turmoil, actions that seemed almost rehearsed. I'd watch videos on my phone, recordings I didn't recall making, where I appeared to be laughing at jokes or having conversations that I couldn't possibly remember. It was as if parts of me were being edited out of my life, rearranged by some unseen hand. I tried to speak with friends and family, to explain that things weren't as they seemed. I told my sister about the odd feeling that time was being stolen from me, that I was acting out parts of my day without my consent. But she only patted me on the back and said I must be stressed, that everyone forgets little things sometimes. My best friend, once my confidant, looked at me with pity and suggested that maybe I was just overthinking it. No one else noticed the inexplicable gaps in my memory, or the way I'd sometimes say things that weren't my own words. Their dismissals left me isolated with my growing dread. As the days passed, the phenomenon escalated. One afternoon, I walked home from work and found myself inexplicably standing in front of a building I had never seen before, a modern structure in the middle of a familiar, aging neighborhood. I remember feeling an icy chill as I looked around, convinced that I'd somehow slipped into an alternate version of my own town. When I asked a passerby about it, they merely shrugged and said, "This is the neighborhood now, isn't it?" Their voices held no recognition of the old streets I cherished, as if I were the only one who remembered them. Then there were the subtle messages. I began to notice that everyday items in my apartment would change positions, as if someone had deliberately rearranged them. I'd leave my wallet on the coffee table, only to find it later on my desk, with a small note taped to it. "You forgot again." The handwriting was eerily familiar, yet I was certain I hadn't written it. In the quiet of night, I'd sometimes wake to see words scrawled on my bathroom mirror in fog, letters that quickly vanished as I blinked them away. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if something was deliberately rewriting the details of my life. The most harrowing moment came on a cold, rain-soaked evening. I returned home to find my apartment plunged into silence, with the lights dimmed to an unearthly glow. As I fumbled for the switch, I caught a glimpse of movement in the peripheral of my vision, a shadow moving in the mirror behind me. I turned sharply, heart pounding, only to see my reflection stare back with eyes that looked resigned, as if it had seen too much. In that instant, I felt an overwhelming sense that my actions, my thoughts, and even my memories were not entirely my own. It was as if something was guiding me, rearranging my days without my permission. I began to suspect that I was being controlled from within, a puppet to an unseen force that dictated what I should do, what I should say. I found that I sometimes performed tasks without conscious thought, only to later discover evidence of those actions in places I couldn't remember visiting. My friends started to remark on how I had changed, but not in the sense of growing up or evolving. Rather, they noted a dissonance in my personality, as if my true self was being overwritten by someone else's design. I watched myself, day after day, like a character in a poorly scripted play, each scene repeating with slight variations, always leaving me with that unshakable feeling of intrusion. Now, as I sit in the dark of my room, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside, I feel a constant oppressive pressure, a sense that my every thought is monitored, my every decision preordained. I no longer trust the memories that fill my mind. They feel like fragments of a narrative written by someone else. The fear that I'm losing control of my own life is suffocating. I've tried to find answers, to speak with anyone who might understand, but every time I search for meaning, I'm met with blank stares or dismissive words. I am left with the chilling realization that I may never have all the answers I seek. The inexplicable gaps in time, the altered conversations, the ghostly instructions left on my belongings, they all point to a presence I can neither see nor escape. Whether it is a product of my own unraveling mind or a darker force manipulating my reality, I remain trapped in a state of constant surveillance by something from within. And though I desperately cling to the hope that I might one day reclaim control over my own life, I know deep down that the feeling of being controlled, watched, even will never fully leave me. Each day, I awaken with the dread that my free will is slipping away, and that somewhere out there, an unseen force continues to steer my every move. I had lived in the same place for 3 years, so I knew every scratch and dent, every tiny imperfection. I knew the way the deadbolt clicked, the way the handle stuck slightly in humid weather. But one evening, as I returned home from work, I put my key into the lock, and it didn't fit. I frowned, turning the key over in my hand. It was definitely mine, the same one I had used that morning. I tried again, jiggling it a little, and this time the key slid in. The door opened smoothly, too smoothly. I stepped inside, and nothing seemed amiss. My couch, my books, my shoes by the door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something subtle. It wasn't until I went to put my keys on the counter that I saw it. My fridge. It was the same model, the same size, but the door handle was on the left side instead of the right. My stomach dropped. I stood there, staring at it, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Had it always been like that? No. I knew for a fact that it hadn't. I opened the fridge, scanning the contents, and everything was where it should be. My leftovers, my drinks, but the eggs were in the wrong place. I always put them on the top shelf, but now they were in the middle. I told myself I was just tired. Maybe I had moved them without thinking. Maybe I was misremembering the handle. But as I sat down on my couch, that unease settled deep in my bones. Over the next few days, the changes kept coming. Little things easy to explain away. A book I swore I had left on the coffee table now on the shelf. The clock on the wall ticking just slightly slower than I remembered. My phone charging cable being a few inches to the left of where I always left it. I convinced myself it was nothing. Then, one morning I woke up and my bedroom window was on the wrong wall. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. The window had always faced east. I knew that. I had woken up to the sunrise every morning since I moved in. But now, it was on the opposite wall where my dresser had been. The dresser was still there, just moved, like my entire room had been subtly rearranged in the night. I ran out to the living room. Everything was in its place. The fridge still wrong, the books still shifted. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend, Sarah. I think I'm losing my mind, I told her, laughing nervously. Why? What's wrong? My apartment stuff keeps moving, but not like I forgot where I put it. It's like changing. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she sighed. You've been stressed, haven't you? You always get like this when you don't sleep enough. I felt my stomach twist. No, Sarah, this is different. My window moved. She chuckled. You're scaring yourself over nothing. Maybe it was always there, and you just never paid attention. Her casual dismissal made something inside me go cold. I hung up soon after, unsatisfied, still rattled. But I tried to convince myself she was right. I was just tired, stressed. Maybe I had misremembered. That night, I double-checked everything before bed. I placed a book in the center of my coffee table. I aligned my shoes perfectly by the door. I took pictures of my kitchen, my bedroom, every little detail. When I woke up, the book was gone. My shoes were turned inward. In my pictures, every single one was missing from my phone. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. I knew I had taken them. I had looked at them before bed, but they were just gone. That's when the people started acting strange. The barista at my usual coffee shop, who greeted me every morning with the same cheerful, "Hey, you want your usual?" acted like she didn't know me. She took my order without looking at me, without the smallest flicker of recognition. The neighbor I had nodded to for years in the hallway walked past me like I was a stranger. And then there was my coworker, Eric. At lunch, I sat across from him in the break room, trying to ground myself in the normalcy of small talk. I told him about a funny thing that had happened last week, something he had been there for. He frowned. "That never happened." I let out a nervous laugh. "Yeah, it did. You were right there." He just shook his head, looking confused. "I think you're remembering wrong." I felt my stomach turn. No, I wasn't wrong. Then, the next day, he acted like the conversation had never happened at all. I went back to Sarah, desperate. "You remember my fridge, right? The way it used to be." She gave me a blank stare. "What are you talking about?" "My fridge. The handle was on the other side. You've been to my apartment 100 times. You have to remember." She gave me this pitying look, like I was losing my grip on reality. "It's always been that way, Han." I wanted to scream. That night, I didn't sleep. Every noise in the apartment felt closer, like the walls themselves were shifting around me. I locked my bedroom door. I pushed my dresser in front of it. And still, at some point in the night, I must have blacked out because I woke up to find my door open, my dresser back in its original place. I checked my phone. A single, new photo was in my gallery. It was a picture of me, sleeping. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'm going crazy, if something is messing with me, or if I somehow slipped into a place where things look the same, but aren't. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys. I didn't even care about my stuff. I just needed to go. But when I opened the door to my apartment, I froze. The hallway outside was wrong. The walls stretched too far. The doors slightly off-center, like a poorly recreated version of the building I had known. And standing at the end of the hallway was Sarah. Only, she wasn't moving. She wasn't smiling. She was just standing there, staring at me. I don't remember shutting the door, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was back in my apartment, sitting on my couch, my hands shaking. I don't know if it's the same place I woke up in yesterday, or the day before that. I don't even know if I'll wake up in the same apartment tomorrow. But I do know one thing. It's not mine anymore. I moved into my new apartment about a year ago, expecting nothing more than a fresh start. At first, everything felt normal, routine, and familiar, if a little worn from years of occupancy. But then, subtle changes began to creep in. It started with small things. One morning, I found my favorite framed photograph had been turned face down on the mantel. I thought I must have forgotten to set it upright, but I distinctly remembered straightening it the night before. Then I noticed that the cushion on my armchair, which I always arranged just so, was slightly out of place when I returned from work. At first, I dismissed it as my own absent-mindedness, but soon the oddities grew too frequent to ignore. Late one evening, I came home to find that the bookshelf in my living room, which had always been organized by genre and size, now seemed to have been rearranged with no apparent logic. Books I remembered placing on the top shelf were now nestled at the bottom, and one volume of poetry lay inverted as if someone had deliberately hidden it. I asked my neighbor about it, expecting some playful mischief, but she simply shook her head and said, "I'm sure you left it that way, dear." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were distant, as if she were reading from a script already memorized. The changes extended beyond inanimate objects. At work, I started noticing that colleagues, people I'd known for years, began acting in ways that felt slightly off. My usually jovial coworker, Mark, began speaking in a clipped, measured tone, and when I mentioned our usual inside jokes, he only offered a blank stare. A friend from my weekly book club commented that our last discussion on literature felt strangely rehearsed, as if the topics had been predetermined. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that stress was playing tricks on me, but the nagging sensation that something was fundamentally amiss persisted. One day, while taking my usual route home, I passed by a cafe that I frequented for its quiet ambience and reliable coffee. As I walked in, I realized that the arrangement of tables had changed slightly, and the barista, someone I'd chatted with on many lazy afternoons, greeted me with a curt nod instead of her usual warm smile. "Hello," I said, but she merely mumbled, "Good morning," before turning away. Outside, I noticed a car parked in the lot that I was sure hadn't been there the day before, its paint a shade I didn't recognize. Every time I returned to that same street, the details shifted ever so subtly. The same storefront would display a different poster. A lamppost would be missing a part of its decoration, and a stray dog that I'd seen once would now appear almost daily, always watching me with unsettling, unblinking eyes. At home, the changes reached a crescendo. One night, I woke up to a soft scraping noise near my bedroom door. Bleary-eyed, I got up and flicked on the light, only to see faint, smudged handprints trailing down the wall. They looked fresh, as if someone had just been there, yet I lived alone. I checked every room, my study, the bathroom, even the narrow balcony, but found nothing out of place except for the lingering smell of damp earth and something metallic. My phone's clock showed that only minutes had passed, but my mind felt as if it were trapped in a time loop where each second stretched out like an eternity. I began to document these incidents in a notebook, recording the times and locations, the precise details that no one else seemed to notice. Each entry ended with a question. Am I losing my grip on reality? When I brought up these oddities to friends and even my family, they dismissed my concerns as overactive imagination or stress-induced paranoia. Everything's the same, they'd insist. You're just tired. But I knew what I'd seen. The shifted furniture, the rearranged books, the subtle changes that added up to something far larger than mere forgetfulness. The final breaking point came one morning when I returned to my apartment after a long day at work. I walked into the living room, and everything was as it had been for months. Yet something was different. The sunlight streaming through the window cast odd, elongated shadows across the floor, and the sound of my footsteps echoed in a way that felt off. I looked at my reflection in the darkened glass of a framed mirror and saw not just my tired face, but a flicker of movement behind me, a shadow that wasn't mine. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there except the silent, unchanging room. I now find myself trapped in a world that seems unchanged to everyone else, but feels utterly alien to me. Every day, I search for signs that could explain the subtle shifts, seeking confirmation from friends who insist nothing has changed. But each time, I'm met with blank disbelief. The furniture, the people, the very air around me seem to be part of a closed loop, a shifting illusion that I can't break free from. I lie awake at night, wondering if I'm the only one who can see these cracks in reality, if I'm doomed to live in a world that grows more hostile and unfamiliar with each passing day. I've come to accept a terrifying possibility, that my surroundings are not as fixed as I once believed, that there is something, some force or design, rewriting my everyday life without my consent. Whether it's a product of my mind or something far more sinister, I cannot shake the feeling that I'm trapped in a reality that only I can see as fractured and foreign. And so I continue, day by day, haunted by the knowledge that while the world appears normal to everyone else, to me it has become a labyrinth of altered memories and shifting details, a place that is both my home and a prison, a reality that might be nothing more than an illusion designed to keep me from knowing the truth. I moved into a modest apartment on the edge of a quiet town. It wasn't much, just a single-bedroom place in a dilapidated building that had seen better days. The rental process was mundane, a set of keys exchanged with a tired landlord and a promise to keep the place tidy. My first night was uneventful. I unpacked my few belongings, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat on the creaking floorboards listening to the hum of the old heating system. It was ordinary, almost comforting in its predictability. The next morning, while taking a walk around the block, I noticed something odd. A small, antique lamp sat on the pavement outside my building, despite not belonging to anyone I knew. At first, I assumed it was discarded by someone else, but it was too pristine to be trash. I picked it up and examined it, its intricate metalwork glinting in the weak sunlight, but found no clues about its owner. I returned it to the building's entrance, thinking perhaps someone might claim it later. That evening, While preparing dinner, I heard a soft thud coming from the hallway. I checked the corridor. It was empty. I shrugged it off as the building's settling, or maybe a stray animal rummaging about. Over the following days, inexplicable occurrences became a constant companion. I'd hear muffled whispers when I was alone in the apartment, and at times, the sound of footsteps in the middle of the night echoed in the quiet spaces. Determined to find a rational explanation, I installed a small camera in my living room. Reviewing the footage, I was stunned to see a fleeting shadow near the doorway at exactly 3:17 a.m., a time that later became disturbingly significant. I tried to share my findings with a friend, but he dismissed it as a trick of the light or a malfunctioning sensor. Then came the incidents I couldn't rationalize. One late night, as I was reading, I felt a cold draft brush past me, though every window was closed. I noticed my breath turning visible before disappearing into the darkness. I went to check the thermostat. It showed a steady, mild temperature. Yet, a lingering chill pervaded the room. My logical mind insisted it was a fluke of temperature variance, but deep down, a sense of dread began to creep in. I started documenting each occurrence in a journal, meticulously noting the time, location, and details of every odd sound or sensation. While reviewing local news for any explanation, I stumbled upon an old report about the building's history. Decades ago, a tenant claimed to have encountered unexplained phenomena in that very apartment. The report mentioned strange lights and eerie sounds that no one could explain, and the case was quietly dismissed as a case of overactive imagination. I felt a chill. Was I experiencing the same inexplicable events? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? The similarity was too uncanny to ignore. One evening, while scrutinizing my notes and reviewing video clips, I observed something even more disturbing. In the footage, a faint figure could be seen moving slowly through the corridor, almost as if it was searching for something. The figure was blurred, indistinct, yet its presence was unmistakable. I enhanced the video using basic software, but the image only grew more obscure and unnerving. The rational part of me fought back against the rising tide of fear, insisting there had to be a logical explanation, a hidden camera reflection, perhaps, but nothing fit the evidence. Late one night, after returning from a weary day at work, I found my apartment door slightly ajar, even though I distinctly remembered locking it. The interior lights flickered erratically, casting ominous shadows on the walls. I ventured in slowly, my heart pounding, only to find everything seemingly untouched, except for a single, inexplicable mark on the doorknob, like a handprint that vanished upon closer inspection. I tried calling the landlord, but the line was dead, and my calls to local authorities yielded no immediate answers, just assurances that it was likely a prank. I wonder if the mysterious lamp I found outside holds a secret significance that ties all these events together. Every time I glance at it, I feel as though it is silently communicating with me, its aged glass reflecting not just my image, but the faint outline of something else behind me. A presence that lingers in the background of my daily life. I spent hours researching local legends and obscure forums, hoping to find any mention of similar occurrences. While most dismiss these stories as urban myths or the product of an overactive imagination, the consistency in their descriptions could not be ignored. One account detailed how an object of little apparent value, much like my lamp, had been a harbinger of inexplicable phenomena in a now-abandoned building in a nearby town. This eerie parallel only deepened my resolve to uncover the truth, even as a gnawing fear took root within me. Late at night, when the world outside fell silent and my mind was left alone with its racing thoughts, I began to consider that perhaps I was not meant to find a logical explanation for these events. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, echoing in the recesses of our memories like a half-remembered nightmare. Even as I record these events with a desperate need for understanding, a part of me wonders if the very act of documenting them might invite further disturbances, an inadvertent summoning of a force that thrives on our curiosity and fear. As I write, I can hear the distant sound of footsteps approaching, a soft, deliberate tread that seems to echo from the depths of an unseen hallway. I tell myself it is merely my imagination, but the cold dread that follows is all too real. The unanswered questions weigh on me. Was the strange lamp truly an anomaly, or was it a deliberate signal left behind by someone or something long gone? Could the subtle, yet persistent, signs of intrusion be the work of a malevolent spirit, or perhaps a more pragmatic, yet sinister, human presence? The more I search for a logical explanation, the more I am forced to confront the possibility that some events defy reason. Even as I compile my evidence and share my findings on online forums, I am met with skepticism and dismissive comments. This only deepens the isolation I feel, as if the truth is locked away in a realm where logic and reality are no longer enough to contain it. Now, as darkness envelopes my small apartment once more and I listen to the quiet hum of the night, I am left with the inescapable realization that not all mysteries are meant to be unraveled. Perhaps the true horror lies not in what has been witnessed, but in the profound uncertainty that persists, a void where answers should reside. I am caught between the need for understanding and the terror of what that understanding might reveal. As the night stretches on, I am left to wonder if some mysteries are destined to remain forever unresolved. It started with the mail, a plain, unmarked envelope wedged between my usual stack of bills and grocery store flyers. No return address, no sender, just my name, neatly printed in block letters. At first, I thought it was a mistake, junk mail maybe, but inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence typed in the center. "You were never supposed to move here." I laughed it off. It had to be a prank. I had just moved into my new apartment a few weeks ago, a small but comfortable place in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the best building, thin walls, outdated appliances, but it was home. I tossed the letter into the trash and didn't think about it again. A week later, I met my neighbor, an older man, maybe late 60s, with deep-set eyes and a too-wide smile. I'd seen him before, always standing on his balcony, watching the parking lot like he was waiting for something. That day, I was hauling groceries up the stairs when he appeared at the top landing. "You finally settled in?" he asked, his voice oddly flat. "Yeah, pretty much," I said, shifting the bags in my arms. He nodded, staring at me for an uncomfortable moment before speaking again. "Did you get the letter?" I nearly dropped my groceries. "What?" "The letter," he repeated. "They send one to everyone. Just ignore it." I forced a laugh, trying to mask my unease. "Oh, yeah, weird prank, right?" His expression didn't change. "Something like that." And then he turned and walked away. That was the first time I felt it, the sense that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't just the letter or the way he had spoken, but the feeling that he knew something I didn't. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice strange things about the building. The lights in the hallway flickered at the same time every night, 8:43 p.m., like clockwork. If I stood in the hallway for too long, I'd hear faint whispers, just at the edge of perception, though I could never make out the words. And the neighbors, none of them ever left. I'd hear them inside their apartments, moving around, but I never saw anyone coming or going. No one checked their mail. No one took out the trash. It was as if they were just waiting inside. Then there was the knocking. It started one night around 2 a.m. A soft, deliberate knock on my door. Not frantic, not impatient, just waiting. I didn't answer. I told myself it was just a drunk neighbor or some kid playing a prank. But when I checked the peephole, the hallway was empty. The knocking came again the next night. Same time, same rhythm. I checked the peephole again, nothing. But when I looked down, I saw something new. A single piece of paper, folded neatly, slid under my door. I hesitated before picking it up. My hands were cold as I unfolded the note. There were only 2 words this time: "Don't listen." That was the night I stopped feeling safe. The next morning, I tried to talk to the building manager, but his office was locked. No one answered when I knocked. I called the emergency number posted by the office, but the voicemail was full. It was like he didn't exist. So I went back to my neighbor, the old man. I knocked on his door, and after a long pause, he finally answered. "You shouldn't be asking questions," he said before I could even speak. I stepped back, suddenly unsure of myself. What's with the knocking at night? And the notes? Is it some kind of joke? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes that unnerved me more than the note's fear. "You need to move," he said quietly, "before they start talking to you." I swallowed hard. "Who?" He shook his head. "Just go." Then he shut the door. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made my skin crawl. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the pipes. Every sound felt deliberate, like the building itself was breathing. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't going to check. I wasn't going to pick up the note. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will it away. But then the whispering started. It wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was inside my apartment. I bolted upright, my breath caught in my throat. The whispers were everywhere, soft, indistinct voices murmuring just beyond my comprehension. A sound like something dragging along the walls. I fumbled for the light switch, but when the bulb flickered to life, the whispers stopped. The apartment was still, except for one thing. On my nightstand, where there had been nothing before, was a piece of paper. I didn't pick it up at first. I just stared at it, stomach twisting into knots. My hands trembled as I finally reached for it. This time, the note was different. The words were shaky, uneven, like whoever wrote it had been afraid. "They know you're listening now." That was it. I packed a bag and left before the sun even rose. I didn't care about breaking my lease or losing my deposit. I just left. I stayed with a friend for a while, and when I finally worked up the nerve to go back for the rest of my stuff a week later, the apartment building was empty. Not abandoned, just empty. The old man's apartment? Vacant. The building manager's office? Cleaned out. No trace of any tenants. Just gone. When I asked the property owner what had happened, they looked at me like I was insane. "That building hasn't had tenants in months," they said. "It's condemned." I don't know what happened in that place, and I don't think I want to. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the knocking, and I still wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. I was driving home on a rainy Thursday evening when it first happened, a subtle, almost imperceptible glitch that made me question everything I knew. The streets looked normal, the familiar neon lights of my favorite diner reflecting on wet asphalt. But for a moment, I felt as if the world around me had stuttered. I slowed down at a red light, only to see the same car in the next lane freeze mid-turn for a heartbeat before resuming its course as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was just a trick of the rain and my imagination. That night, as I pulled into my driveway, the sensation of déjà vu clung to me like the chill of the rain. The next morning, I went about my routine. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. But as I scrolled through my emails, something felt off. A familiar email subject line from a coworker, something I distinctly remembered reading yesterday, appeared again in my inbox, time-stamped exactly 24 hours later. I clicked it, half expecting the message to be identical, but it wasn't. The text was the same, yet the punctuation and capitalization were different in subtle ways. I frowned and closed the email, shaking off a nagging uncertainty. Later that day, while waiting in line at the grocery store, I noticed a woman I recognized, a neighbor I'd waved to many times before. Today, however, she was dressed entirely in black, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. I approached to say hello, but when I uttered a greeting, she looked straight ahead and merely nodded. When I repeated my greeting a second time, she finally turned and fixed me with a cold stare before quickly moving away. I couldn't help but feel that her behavior was out of character, as if she were following a script that didn't match the person I had always known. Over the next few days, the strange incidents multiplied. I began noticing that everyday objects in my apartment were inexplicably out of place. A book I had left on my coffee table one evening was found later on a shelf I never use. My keys, which I was certain I'd placed in a bowl by the door, ended up in the refrigerator one morning. I started keeping a journal, meticulously noting every anomaly, every minute detail that didn't add up, but the more I documented, the more I felt the unsettling weight of repetition. It was as if the world around me was rewriting itself, layer by imperceptible layer. One evening, I decided to test my suspicions. I set my digital clock to count down the seconds before I left for work, and as I stood in the hallway, I distinctly remembered seeing the numbers flicker, like a glitch in an old film reel. I chalked it up to a faulty clock, but then I noticed a pattern. The glitches always occurred at the same time, around 7:13 a.m., and every day since, I had lost precious seconds. I glanced at my watch, only to realize that I was 10 minutes behind schedule, as if time itself had been tampered with. At work, things grew even stranger. I sat at my desk, typing away, when I overheard a conversation between two colleagues. They were discussing a weekend event I knew I hadn't attended, a camping trip with friends I'd never even mentioned. I confronted one of them, asking if I'd been mistaken, but he assured me that he was certain it had happened. When I asked for details, his memory was oddly vague. It was as if my entire reality was being edited while I was oblivious, with certain moments replaced by others that felt alien. That night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the image of a dark figure standing just beyond the window, vanishing as soon as I tried to focus on it. I forced myself to sleep, but my dreams were plagued by the same glitches. Scenes repeating, voices overlapping, a world that looped back on itself like a broken record. I awoke in cold sweats, the echo of my own confused murmurs mingling with the sound of rain against the window. Now, every day feels like I'm caught between two realities. My apartment is the same, yet the layout seems to subtly shift when I'm not looking. My friends and co-workers insist nothing has changed, but I know in my bones that I'm the only one who notices. The missing seconds, the misplaced items, the uncanny repetition of events that should never occur twice. I'll try to talk to someone about it, but every time I describe what I'm experiencing, I'm met with dismissive smiles or polite concern. They tell me it's stress, that my mind is playing tricks on me, but I can't ignore the evidence staring me in the face. I've begun to wonder if I'm trapped in a loop, a fragmented reality where moments are edited and reassembled without my consent. Is it a cosmic glitch in the fabric of existence? Or have I somehow become the unwitting subject of an experiment? One where my perception of time and space is being manipulated? The more I ponder, the more convinced I become that something is profoundly wrong. I can't tell if I've become part of something much bigger, or if reality itself is broken down into fragments only I can see. Tonight, as I sit in the silence of my apartment, I can feel it, a persistent, nagging sense that the world around me is not as it seems. Every creak, every flicker of light, every out-of-place object whispers a secret truth that I'm on the edge of understanding. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being pulled into a narrative I never signed up for, a narrative where the rules of time and space no longer apply, and I'm just a glitch in the matrix. I'm not sure if I'll ever find the answers I need, but one thing is certain. The illusion of normalcy is crumbling, and I'm left wondering if I'm the only one who sees the unraveling of reality. It started with a spoon, a single, ordinary spoon from my kitchen drawer. One night, I made tea, set the spoon on the counter, and left the room for just a moment to grab my phone. When I came back, it was gone. I searched the entire kitchen, checked the floor, the sink, even the trash, thinking maybe I had absent-mindedly knocked it over. Nothing. I shrugged it off. Maybe I had put it somewhere without thinking. A week later, it happened again. This time, a pen I had just used. I was at my desk, jotting down notes, and placed the pen beside my notebook. I turned away for a second, literally a second, to check a notification on my phone. When I turned back, it was gone. I tore the room apart looking for it, growing increasingly frustrated. It wasn't under the desk, not in the drawer, not even behind the notebook. Just gone. I started to feel uneasy, but I told myself it was just stress. People misplace things all the time. Then I began waking up to subtle changes in my apartment. The living room rug, which I had left neatly in place before bed, would be slightly askew in the morning. My bedside lamp, always on the right side of the table, would sometimes be on the left. My shoes would be facing the wrong way at the door. I started to take pictures, just small things, a quick snap of my coffee table, my desk, my bedroom before I went to sleep. When I woke up, I compared them to see if I was imagining it. I wasn't. The changes were real. One night, I set up my phone to record while I slept. I didn't expect to find anything. I just wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The next morning, I hesitated before pressing play. The footage showed me shifting in my sleep, rolling over a few times. Nothing unusual. But then, at 3:47 a.m., something changed. The covers lifted slightly, just an inch, as if someone or something was tugging at them. I stopped the video, my pulse hammering. There was no explanation for that. I lived alone. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. I rewound the footage and watched again, but it was the same thing. My blanket moving just slightly, too purposefully to be a draft. I didn't sleep well after that. The next week, the disappearances escalated. Not just small objects, but bigger things. My kitchen chair went missing. I came home from work, and it just wasn't there. I checked every room, every corner of the apartment. I even checked outside, knowing it was ridiculous. Where would it go? Who would take a single chair? The next morning, it was back, sitting in the exact same place, like it had never been gone. I barely had time to process that before I noticed something else. Thin, almost imperceptible scratches on my front door. 5 of them, like someone had dragged their nails down the wood. I ran my fingers over them, my stomach twisting. They hadn't been there yesterday. I asked my landlord if maintenance had done anything, but he just gave me a blank stare. "No one's been in your unit," he said. I didn't know what to say. I started double-checking my locks every night, placing objects in very specific ways to see if they moved. I even sprinkled salt at my door, not because I believed in that kind of thing, but because I was desperate. It didn't help. One night, I woke up to the sound of something dragging across the floor. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, straining to listen. It came from the living room. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and crept toward the door. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I had to see. The rug. It had moved 5 feet from where it had been, and in the dust underneath, there were footprints. Not mine. They were too small, too narrow, barefoot, and they led toward my bedroom door. I never moved so fast in my life. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and fled. I stayed at a friend's place for a few nights, trying to make sense of it all, trying to tell myself it was just stress, just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I finally went back, I found a note waiting on my kitchen counter. A single sheet of paper. "You shouldn't have left." The handwriting was mine, but I never wrote it. I don't know what's happening. I don't know how to explain it, but I know one thing for sure. Something is in my apartment, and it doesn't want me to leave again. I never imagined that an ordinary evening at home could unravel into a living nightmare, but that's exactly what happened. It began on a cool autumn night last fall. I'd spent the day running errands and preparing dinner in my small, quiet apartment, a place I'd always considered a safe haven. After dinner, I settled into my recliner with a book and a cup of chamomile tea. The soft hum of the heater and the steady patter of rain against the window made for a comforting backdrop. I was lost in the pages when I first heard it, a quiet, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the direction of the living room window. I glanced up, half expecting to see a stray branch tapping against the glass, but there was nothing there, only the inky darkness outside. I told myself it was just my imagination or the wind playing tricks on me. Yet, as the night deepened, a chill crept over the room, and I began to feel as if I were not alone. I kept thinking I saw a fleeting shadow near the window, only to find darkness when I turned to look again. Brushing off the unease, I returned to my book, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. However, sleep wouldn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by the persistent feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes were fixed on me from the corners of the room. The next morning, I awoke with a heavy, disquieting sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, even though I couldn't pinpoint why. I went about my day, trying to dismiss the lingering anxiety, but small, unsettling details began to emerge. At work, a coworker mentioned that she'd heard strange noises coming from my apartment late last night, though I was the only one home. I assumed it must have been the old pipes or the creaks of the building settling, but deep down I knew it was more than that. That night, as I prepared for bed, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible scent of damp earth mixed with something metallic. It was unlike anything I'd ever smelled in my apartment. I checked every window and door. Everything was securely locked. I thought back to the sound of scratching at the window, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I double-checked my locks and settled into bed, but sleep remained elusive as the feeling of intrusion persisted. Over the following week, the disturbances grew bolder. I started to notice small items in my apartment slightly move from where I'd left them. A book placed on the coffee table that was now on the shelf, a lamp that seemed to have been turned off when I was sure I had left it on. I chalked it up to my absent-mindedness at first, but the coincidences were too frequent to ignore. One morning, I found an envelope on my doorstep. It was plain and unremarkable except for a single scrap of paper inside, bearing the words, "I know," scrawled in shaky handwriting. I couldn't fathom who would leave such a message or why, and the sight of it left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. Then came the night that changed everything. Around 3 a.m., I was suddenly awoken by the sensation of pressure on the edge of my bed, as if someone were sitting there. I lay frozen in the darkness, heart pounding in my ears, straining to hear any sound other than my own ragged breathing. I thought I could see a vague outline in the dim light. No distinct features, just a dark silhouette that seemed impossibly close. I mustered the courage to call out, but my voice barely made a sound before the figure dissolved into the blackness. When I finally managed to pull myself together and check every corner of the room, nothing was there. The only evidence was my racing pulse and a lingering coldness that refused to leave. I spent that day in a haze of terror and disbelief, questioning every rational explanation. Had someone been in my apartment? Was it some kind of cruel prank? I reported the incident to the building manager, but he found no signs of forced entry or tampering. Neighbors claimed they hadn't noticed anything unusual, and security footage from the hallway only captured fleeting shadows that couldn't be identified. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation, a malfunctioning sensor, perhaps a trick of the light, but the raw fear in my gut told me otherwise. I moved out 2 weeks later, leaving behind not only the apartment, but a piece of my peace of mind. Even now, months later, I struggle to explain the terror I experienced. Every time I encounter a quiet, dark place or hear a soft, unexplained noise, I am transported back to that night of inexplicable intrusion and lingering dread. I still have that envelope tucked away, a constant, chilling reminder that some mysteries defy logic and reason. This was real, a terrifying, unexplainable event that has haunted me ever since. No rational explanation has ever come close to dispelling the memory of that night, and I remain forever marked by the knowledge that something unfathomable once invaded my sanctuary.